Welcome to this new long-form edition of the Orthodox Ethos podcast. In this debut episode, we're going to be covering a most important topic: Saint Nikodemos the Hagurite, the Rudder, and the reception of the heterodox. A look at the correspondence between Saint Nikodemos, the Kollyvades Fathers, and Dorotheos Voulismas. All right. God bless you and welcome. Glad you're joining us. This is a new format for us in the Orthodox Ethos podcast. Usually it's a 30, 40-minute monologue. But tonight we're going to be doing live streaming. We're going to present a teaching, and we're going to open it up to question and answers at the end. And we're going to call this a new format for Orthodox Ethos podcast, so we can come to you every other week going forward during our lecture series on the Book of Revelation. So every other Tuesday, we'll be here presenting particular topics and issues to all of you. And I think they're going to be very interesting and very enlightening. We're going to go deep. We're going to get into some very timely and perhaps controversial matters that are facing the church today. And so we're going to jump right into it and get you an introduction to what this podcast is going to be like. You're going to see tonight an example of that. Also, for all of you who are following us during the Revelation class, again, it bears repeating. We're going to be here every other Tuesday and every Thursday via Crowdcast to answer your questions on the Book of Revelation. This Thursday, we're going to be answering questions from this course tonight and any other questions you have in your struggle, in your spiritual life, whatever you have to bring. We'll try to support you in that. But it will be a continuation, let's say, of tonight's class on Saint Nikodemos and the Kollyvades. This is one of my most important topics for me personally, something I spent a long time researching and looking into. The question of the reception, of course, of converts, the question of baptism, the question of the boundaries of the church, something I've spent literally 30 years since I walked into the Orthodox Church. Has been an issue that's somewhat forced on us as converts, but also in my case, it's been for a variety of reasons by God's providence, something that's always before me and is dear to my heart. So tonight, for me, this is a very important topic. I hope all of you pay close attention, even those who are not well informed or knowledgeable about the ins and outs. If you're patient and you come back again and again, you'll see just how important these are. This is the equivalent. This whole question of the boundaries of the church and the reception of converts is equivalent in our day to the great theological, Christological controversies of the 4th century, 5th century, 6th century, iconoclast period. This is a threat and a challenge to the church. The question of contemporary ecumenism, the pan-heresy of ecumenism, and all that these various theories bring is a challenge, if not, we could say even worse, a greater challenge than those ancient heresies for a variety of reasons, because of the situation in the world today, the spiritual condition of Christians. It even poses a greater threat than any other heresy in the history of the church. So before we get off on a tangent, let's jump right in. Let's put on the screen here our slides. Let's go back to the beginning. Sorry about that. And here we are, Saint Nikodemos, of course, on the left, the Rudder and the reception of the heterodox, a look at the correspondence between the Kollyvades Fathers and Dorotheos Voulismas. We're going to split the Kollyvades Fathers. Who is Dorotheos Voulismas? Who is Saint Nikodemos? We'll start there. So if you have zero knowledge of this topic, if you're patient and pay attention, you will learn a lot tonight. So Saint Nikodemos, of course, for all of us who love him and revere him, there are so many reasons to do that. We're going to be talking about this particular controversy that's come out in the last couple of years. But before we do that, we'll get into life. But this is the particular controversy that's been brought out first in Greece and in Greek, and now in English because of a translation of a document by Theodore Yangou, and claims by Theodore Yangou. He's a professor of canon law in the pastoral theology department at the University of Thessaloniki. That's where I studied, did my undergraduate, graduate, and master's degrees, and had opportunity to frequent the office of Dr. Yangou a few times during my undergraduate, especially. But I was in the theological department, so I didn't spend much time there. And these were restated in a book review of my book by Father John Cox on Orthodox and Heterodoxy, which I'll bring up on the screen just so you all can see what I'm talking about. And this was the review that, let's see. This was the review that was written. It's quite some time now. I read it actually several months after it was issued. And I've been, now it's what, four years going on, 4 years. I never responded to this, but we're beginning our response tonight. And if you go down, he's got a lot of different sections here in his critique. The one we're interested in is this one right here, St. Nikodemos and the Rudder. That's the section we're going to be talking about. We're not going to get into any other topics, only this section tonight. And that's why I'm calling this part one, because I'm sure we'll have to return again and again to these issues, very important issues for our church today. So this is St. Nicodemus and the Rudder. He's examining this pretty much, it seems like, based almost entirely on the ideas and the work of Theodore Yangou, who is, again, a professor of canon law at the University of Thessaloniki, very involved on a variety of levels in pan-Orthodox, but also in ecumenical dialogues, ecumenical exchanges, but also very involved on a pan-Orthodox level for the ecumenical patriarchate. And he's from the Church of Cyprus. He's a Cyprian. He's, I think, been in Thessaloniki for quite some time, for probably most of his life. But in any case, that's the original, for me at least, that's the starting point here in this discussion. And then in addition to this, he cites this translation of Dr. Yangou's, one of Dr. Yangou's papers. He actually gave quite a number of speeches over the years. We've been hearing about this in Greece, this idea that he has concerning St. Nicodemus for quite some time. And this actually is not particularly on just St. Nicodemus and the canonist Christophoros. It's actually a response to Metropolitan Dorotheos Voulismas. It's written, I think, I think it's in 2016, I want to say, right around the time of the council in Crete. And it's actually the only, really, the beginning of this, for us, our interest starts quite further down in this area here, where he starts talking about St. Nicodemus and his ideas about St. Nicodemus' position vis-a-vis his own book, The Rudder. And that's what we're going to discuss tonight. So you can find those online. And if you want to go deeper and you want to read exactly what they're saying, we're going to quote a few things from them tonight. Not a ton. We're going to get the major points, and then we're going to talk about what the saints say. In addition tonight to those two personalities, obviously, who are playing a part in our discussion, we have at the center is the great Hagurite St. Nicodemus. And of course, anyone who's familiar with our work over the years knows how much we love him and revere him. And we were so blessed in 2000, over a number of years, 2006, 2007, 2008, to be on the recipient end of the translation of our very good priest, Father George Dokas, who's in the Greek Archdiocese. He translated this book that you probably, most of you know about. Let's see if we can get a focus here. There we go. This is the Exomologitarion of St. Nicodemus, a manual of confession, which we published on Come Out and Press. Thanks be to God, we're bringing it back out. So many people write us and say, when's it coming back out? Very soon. It's It's ready. It's been laid out, but there's so many things going on at once that it takes forever to get the press. But we're very excited. This will be coming out. We also, of course, have published 2 other books by Saint Nicodemus on frequent communion rather, and his confession of faith. And God willing, we'll publish even more by the great saint. So we at Unca Mountain Press, Orthodox, have great love and respect for Saint Nicodemus. A few words about him for those who don't know who he is. I encourage you to read as much as you can about him and read his writings, which have been so important for the church over the last 250 years, especially in the Greek-speaking world. So he was born in 1749 in Naxos, Greece. He was possessed of a great acuteness of mind, accurate perception, intellectual brightness, and vast memory. His memory was just phenomenal. And of course, he didn't have access to any of our modern devices. So that served him very, very well in his work, which was he produced a ton of material in his rather, not very lengthy life. He was born in 1749 and reposed in 1809. So we're talking 60 years. Wasn't that long of his life. He died fairly young comparatively to us today. And yet, in those 40 years of great production, or even 35, he produced so much material. A lot of it was editing. A lot of it was, translating, and not literally translating from other language necessarily, but translating into a language and presenting it in a way that the faithful could digest it and could have access to it. He was extremely pastoral in his approach, as all the saints are, as all the church fathers are. We don't have but just a few that we could say, I don't know if we could even say that, academic oriented. All the church fathers were first and foremost of the church, in the church, and for the church, and for the faithful. And Saint Nicodemus is no exception. He passed from the tutelage of his parish priest to that of Archimandrite Chrysanthos, who was, interestingly, we forget how closely connected all the saints are, the brother of Saint Cosmas Etelos, the great missionary to the enslaved people under the Ottomans, the Greek people in Western, mainly all over Greece, but mainly in Western and Southern Macedonia and Epirus and Southern Greece. He studied theology, studied ancient Greek, of course, Latin, French, and Italian at the Evangelical school. This is the school in Smyrna. So he went to Smyrna, across the way from Naxos, his home. Of course, Naxos is an island near Paros, Naxos, Paros. They're right next to each other. And we have, for instance, from these islands, we have Saint Joseph the Hesychist. We have the Metropolitan of Florina, Augustinos. We have Saint Philotheos Zervakos, the great confessor of the faith in the 20th century. And then he returned to Naxos in 1770 due to the persecution from the Ottomans. Not really sure the details of that. In 1775, so he was now age 21, and in 1775, age 26, he becomes a monk at Dionisio Monastery on Mount Athos. He was initiated into the practice of hesychia, a method of prayer involving inner stillness and, of course, repetition of the Jesus prayer. This is the life of the monk on Mount Athos. It is important, although not essential, but it's extremely helpful when we read the lives of the saints, we understand a little bit about their environment and their spiritual life. And so someone who's actually been to Mount Athos, spent time in Mount Athos, frequented Mount Athos, it helps tremendously to stand in, I think, proper awe and respect for the great saints, because anyone who spent time on Mount Athos understands the tremendous spiritual climate that they live in, and the amassed wisdom of all the Holy Fathers, the experience in the spiritual life. It's unparalleled, and it has been unparalleled for the Orthodox Church for hundreds and hundreds of years. And so it's no small thing to become a monk on Mount Athos and to be initiated into the practice of hesychia. It is not unconnected to his greatness as a church father, as a writer, as a defender, and as a teacher. It's a presupposition in many ways. So different than our cold Western academic mentality that approaches theology like any other discipline, which is just a rationalistic endeavor. No, this is totally different. And he quickly within a few years, because right when he became a monk, it was already going on essentially, or about to be, let's say, erupting, and that is the whole Kollyvades movement, the whole controversy surrounding the question of when do we pray the memorial services. And of course, up until that point on Manathos, it had always been Saturday, but I'm not going to get into the whole question of the controversy of the Kollyva and all that on Manathos, but these were the most refined and most theologically astute monks of their time, and it's been proven over time because many of them became saints and are recognized as saints today. A huge movement that went on for quite some time, even after the repose of the initial monks like Saint Nicodemus and Saint Makarios of Corinth, a retired bishop, or Saint Athanasius of Paros, great saint as well. We're hoping on Economia Press to translate and publish some of his works as well. So he allied himself with these monks who were persecuted in their day. We forget the saints are persecuted. If you look around today, you say, where are the saints? Who's being persecuted? That's probably where you're going to find some saints. And this is the case in his time when he was talking about frequent communion. It was unfortunately a scandal even for monks at Manathos. When he was talking against these innovations in worship, when he was talking against the compromise with in terms of ecclesiology or in terms of the mysteries we're going to talk about tonight, all these things put him against the spirit of the world, as always. And so he was persecuted. And there were Kollyvades Fathers who were exiled from Manathos. He was not. He was not exiled. He spent the remainder of his life and had great respect among many on Athos and elsewhere. Of course, he became very well known through all of the books that were published through his work. He remained there in his kili. Eventually, he went to Karies. He left the Dionysia monastery. He went to Karies, and he had a kili. And night and day, he translated and published those works, and original books, but also he was an editor of many books. Now, we could go on and talk about his books for quite some time, but we're not going to do that. We're just giving you a little taste of who is the person, Saint Nicodemus. He labored for restoration, for the practice of the Saturday commemoration services, as we mentioned, for patristic ecclesiology, and generally for synthesis of economy and strictness in the application of the canons. That's exactly what we're going to talk about tonight, Economia, akrivia, and how that's understood. And he reposed in the Lord, as we said, on July 14th, that's his feast day, and was glorified in the Orthodox Church on May 31st, 1955. Now, we're going to jump right into the controversy because we've got a lot to talk about. But as you'll see going on, we're going to talk also about St. Paisis Voulismas, very important. And you'll hear the names of St. Athanasius Paros. So the Kollyvades Fathers, this is what needs to be, the context is very important because there's statements here that we're going to see that just jar. I mean, they're jarring statements because they're so disconnected from the context of the Holy Fathers, the Kollyvades Fathers, and Athos. So it's extremely important to understand that the Kollyvades Fathers were of one mind on the topic tonight. St. Athanasius Paros, stricter in many ways, but of one mind. St. Paisis Voulismas, of one mind on the question that we're going to talk about tonight. And so it's jarring when Professor Yangou comes and says, as he did, and I remember this very well, and we had discussions when he first came out. It would have been 2000, I want to say 2012 maybe, or even maybe 6. I don't remember actually now. It's probably about before, I think it was before the council in Crete for sure. And he's published a number of things, so it's hard for me to remember exactly the dates, but it's got to be about 8 years. And so when he came out and said and wrote and said, oh, by the way, the Saint Nicodemus that you know about and you read about in the Pedalion, in the Rudder, that's actually not the real Saint Nicodemus. Okay. We've discovered the real St. Nicodemus. We have these manuscripts we found. They're unpublished. And I've gone through them all. And I can tell you that that's not his position. He was not for rebaptism of the papal Protestants, the Latins. He was not for even reordination. You know, I remember that very well. Everybody went, what is he talking about? What is this man talking about? On what basis? So we were extremely interested. Of course, I remember I was talking to Father Theodosius at the time, and he said, don't worry. It'll all come out in due time. And he said, let's see the text. He said, let's see the text. He's an old timer. He knows not to get too worried. He knew who Yangou was. He was a co-professor with him for years and years in the department. So, but people were, kind of wondering what's going on. How could this be? So on what basis is Yangou saying all this? Because this is obviously not what we see in the Rudder, in his own book, right? He published, it was his book, right? It was his name on it. So there's so much to discuss here. And this is why this is part one, but we're going to get just into some major points, which are going to answer some of the questions raised by just two of the excerpts. Now, these are excerpts. I chose to take the first two excerpts from Father John Cox's, summary or analysis of Yangou's work and the question of St. Nicodemus and the Rudder, because he succinctly states it. I actually think Father John, and I'd love to have a discussion someday with Father John, that Father John just probably trusted a lot in Professor Yangou and his position. And of course, I don't think Father John reads Greek. Maybe he does, but my guess is he doesn't, because there's so much more in Greek. If one had access to the Greek, it would be really help him and assist him to see the thing in a fuller context. And before I go on, actually, the text is not here, but it's I've showed it to you before. Unfortunately, it's in the other room. This 800-page tome of all of the correspondence of Saint Nicodemus and Dorotheos Voulismas. This is what Professor Yangou had been talking about, that he had access to, and he had brought out. And and it turns out that there were some other people who were doing the same research from the monastery of Panagia Chrysopodoritsa. I'm butchering that. The Mother of God, the monastery of the Mother of God of ancient monastery, just outside of Patra in southern Greece. I've been to the monastery. It's off limits to women. It's like Mount Athos in that way, and it's very hesychastic. It's run by the abbot there, Father Nikodemos, happens to have the same name and the saint, Barousis, and he spoke. We spoke together at the conference in 2000. And what was it, 2004 or 3? 2003, I can't remember now. It's the Conference on Ecumenism, sponsored by the Department of Pastoral Theology at the University of Thessaloniki. He was one of the speakers. I met him then, and then we visited him at his monastery. And it's a tremendously great honor to have stood side by side with Elder Abbot Nicodemus. Now, he and his brotherhood have spent many years researching and publishing manuscripts by the Kollyvades Fathers. They have studies on it, they have books on it, and they have their own critical editions. And so they came out last year with just an amazing work, in which they have the correspondence, of course, of St. Nicodemus and Theodoros Voulismas. So we're going to talk about who is Theodoros Voulismas. Let's get to know him a little bit as well. Came out with that correspondence, but they didn't stop there. They had other letters that were pertinent to the whole discussion. So they have letters between Voulismas and St. Paisius Veliskovsky. They have letters and between the saints and the patriarch, or the saints and others like Athanasius Paros. And so you have a wide spectrum here. You can see the whole thing in context, right? And they brought about a lot of interesting information that I'm not sure, but I don't think Professor Yangou had in mind, at least not all of it, because I don't think he would have come to his conclusions if he did. And so this came out about a year ago, and it was so wonderful to receive and to see. And these questions that had lingered in the back of my mind about Professor Yangou's claims were thoroughly answered. They were thoroughly answered because we had in front of us the actual letters, finally, that he had talked about publishing for a long time. He just came out with them 3 months ago, finally, his own version, which I've ordered and I look forward to reading. But we had this a year earlier, rather, from Abbot Nikodemos. We're going to quote him quite a bit tonight in his commentary, his footnotes to the comment to the letters, and succinctly, I'm quoting a few things from Father John, which are basic, I think, based in agreement with Professor Yangou, but you're going to see as we go through this that there's big misunderstanding. They don't understand, or they didn't see, or he didn't see, Professor Yangou didn't see that he was not understanding, maybe misrepresenting the saint. So in that article that I mentioned earlier, there's a section on St. Nicodemus, and he says the following, Father John. Drawing on the tome of St. Cyril V. Now, I have to stop a lot because I'm assuming most of you don't have a lot of knowledge of the historical context, the events that are going on there. So I want to make sure everybody's up to date. The great tome, the great important tome of the 18th century on the question of the reception of Latins / Papal Protestants into the Orthodox Church by Cyril V and two other patriarchs, I think it was 1755 to 56, is what he's referring to, which was a text that, of course, was controversial, certainly, because this is still 300 years later, we're still having a lot of discussion and controversy around this topic. It's not surprising it was controversial in his day. But he's saying that Voulismas was drawing on this tome in a discussion, in an exchange with St. Nicodemus. All right, so as you'll see, Professor Yangou presents Theological Voulismas as almost someone that stands against or across from St. Nicodemus, as someone who's not really a part of the Kollyvades Fathers, not really with them, not in agreement with them. That's certainly the implication of a lot of what I've read. And as you'll see, that's not at all the case. That's not at all the case. It's very clearly the opposite. They were of one mind, they were brothers, and they worked and they supported one another continually. And so there was not this way. What's presented is the patriarchate and the political machinations of the day and the desires of Neophytos, the patriarch after a few years after Cyril, who was dealing with the question of, is the Rudder, the book of canons that St. Nicodemus produced, which is what Voulismas is reviewing on behalf of the patriarchate, is it acceptable? Can it be distributed to the faithful and to the church? Is it perfectly acceptable and according to the Orthodox faith? And so the Holy Synod asked Voulismas, that's his last name, Voulismas, this learned preacher and teacher of the faith, to review it on behalf and to report to them, okay, which he did for a number of texts, as we'll see. And so I don't, in my reading of so far the correspondence, it's a huge text. I haven't read it at all. I don't really see him referring much at all to the tome of Cyril V, but let's just leave that aside. That's not really that important. Voulismas argued that St. Nicodemus must alter the text of the Rudder, that's the book of canons that he was producing for the sake of the church, the enlightenment of the people, in regard to his commentary on the reception of heretics and schismatics, specifically Roman Catholics, because in St. Nicodemus' original reading of the canonical tradition, laity converting from the RCC, the Roman Catholic Church, did not need to be rebaptized. And clergy coming from Rome did not need to be reordained. Okay, that's the statement by Father John Cox. I'm assuming, again, largely based on what he's read in the article that's been translated by Professor Yangou. I could be mistaken. Maybe he does know Greek. Maybe he's read a lot. But in any case, that's in agreement with what we're seeing from Professor Yangou and contemporary ecumenists for the most part. But is that the case? Is that the case? Is he talking about, in this context, when they're having this friendly debate, basically, an exchange for the sake of precision and understanding, is the question in that context where they have this exchange in their letters, is it about papal mysteries? No, it's not. It's not about papal mysteries. You'll see, and you'll understand that this is a total misreading of what was going on between the two men. Now he goes on and he says other things. I'm just going to put that out there. Then we'll go through and we'll talk about aspects of these claims. St. Nicodemus' proposed reading, this is Father John Cox, again, writing in his book review of my book. St. Nicodemus' proposed reading was entirely unacceptable to Voulismas. Entirely unacceptable. Not at all. They were in basic agreement. It was details of just how far one would go in their demands of criteria for economy. It's not at all true that they were entirely unacceptable to Voulismas. Quite the contrary. It was very few things that were at question, and there was a difference of views on aspects of the question of Kollyvades and Economia, and not at all any disagreement on the basics. Whereas today you have many in the West, especially, and I mean America and the English-speaking Orthodox world, who think that the whole interpretive key of our pastoral practice with regard to the reception of the heterodox, that is the interpretive key of Economia, which is given. It's given here in this discussion. No one questions this, that this is the interpretive key. In many cases in the West, you see people don't even accept it as an interpretive key. So they're not even beginning in the same place as Saint Nikodemos, Voulismas, Paisios, but not just these great saints, the entire Greek world. No one till this day, if they're serious, doubts this. The discussion happens on this basis. Whereas unfortunately, tragically, Father George Florovsky, a great scholar, a great and tremendous scholar for the church who brought so much to so many people, he got this all wrong. And he rejected the interpretive key that has never been doubted and is not doubted this day. If you can go and find patriarchal bishops in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, I think to this day, I mean, I would be very surprised if any of them have turned their back on this, but they're operating in this context and they're talking about mysteries in this context. Of course, the great, one of the most important books by the Bishop of Myra is on this basis and on the question of the mysteries of the Papists or of the Latins. In any case, it goes on. In the end, St. Nicodemus was compelled by Patriarch Neophytos, the patriarch at the time, who was giving this job to Voulismas on the part of the Ecumenical Patriarchate, to adjust the text of the Rudder to the satisfaction of Voulismas. Okay, so what's presented here is that he's kind of a tyrant, and he says either my way or the highway. It's either my reading of this or you don't get your book. Okay, that's what's presented by Professor Yangou. Or it's not going to be printed. Okay, it's either Voulismas's will and our will, or it doesn't get printed. And Father John goes on. Thus, the relevant portions of the final text, such as the commentary on Apostolic Canon 46, this is one of the most extensive commentaries in the Pedalion on the question of heretical mysteries, heretical baptism in particular. And he has a parenthesis here, which canon was commonly and mistakenly believed to have actual apostolic authorship, which, forgive me, but it's totally irrelevant whether it has, for the sake of the church and it accepting it and embracing it in its consciousness for 2,000 years or 500 or 600 years, those canons have never been doubted as being of apostolic origin in the sense of being totally in agreement with the Holy Fathers and the Apostles. And whether it was written in the 4th century, the 1st century, the 3rd century, the 5th century is irrelevant. But anyway, people like to point that out as somehow we should maybe we should have some doubts about the canons, which, canons that are accepted by ecumenical councils, we have no doubt about. But in any case, such as the commentary on Apostolic Canon 46, give no obvious intimation of the opinions apparently expressed in early drafts. So he's saying that it's Canon 46 in particular, but others apparently are not found in earlier drafts. It's a totally different read. Is that true? We'll see in a minute. So it's as if Voulismas imposed his opinions and his views on St. Nicodemus. St. Nicodemus because he really wanted the book to get published. He just had to go along with it, which is not very flattering for St. Nicodemus, to say the least. He goes on, Father John. As such, when it comes to the question of baptism in general and the reception of Roman Catholics in particular, again, as if these discussions were particularly and first and foremost, in other words, the disagreements, right? The disagreements, as if they were about the papal Protestants and the Latins. That's not the case, but in any case, that's the implication. Commentary of the Rudder bears the stamp of Voulismas' own theological convictions, not those of St. Nicodemus. I wonder if Father John and Professor Theodore Yangou understand the implications of their words. They're basically saying that St. Nicodemus was not a principled man. And that because he wanted to get his book published and he wanted to get, not have it sit on the side, he was going to compromise on issues as fundamental as the boundaries of the church, the nature of the mysteries. As St. Nicodemus was that kind of man. We certainly don't have that image of St. Nicodemus. And that's why, again, it was so shocking for a lot of people to hear Professor Yangou say, 8 years ago, I forget when it was, it's all been a mistake. Actually, St. Nicodemus doesn't believe what he writes in his own book. In other words, it has his own name on it. It's sad because you're impugning the stance and the character of this great saint. And what kind of saint would do that? He would not do that. And he did not do that. That's the good news. He didn't do that. So let's find out, what did he do? Now, I'm going to be quoting from Father Nikodemos Barousis, and this is, of course, the book Kollyvades and Dorotheos Voulismas, this massive collection of the correspondence of the Kollyvades and Dorotheos Voulismas around the question mainly of the rudder, but also other issues, as you'll see. And again, I think it's wonderful that we can sit at the feet of this contemporary abbot and elder and very wise spiritual father. So what does he have to say? Because he's addressing all these concerns of Professor Yangou, of course, without naming him. Well, he actually names him a few times, but it's implied quite a bit in the commentary, in the footnotes to these exchanges, all the letters. And he says, the disagreement of the two sides regarding the issue of the priesthood and baptism of the heretics was an interpretive disagreement on the economia that was applied historically, and not a pastoral disagreement on the economia to be applied in their own time. Okay, here's the distinction that I don't think Father John could have gotten because he didn't have access probably, but certainly I don't know why Professor Yangou doesn't get it. They were talking about in those particular letters about the historical application and the nature of economia and how it works. They were not talking about the contemporary question of papal/Latin baptism. Okay, he goes on. That is, they disagreed as to what was the exact historical canonical background of the witness cases of economia. So in particular, we'll look at this, but I'm going to restate this a few times. In particular, we're talking about certain instances like the Seventh Ecumenical Council. And what are the presuppositions? What's the background? On what basis did the Holy Fathers, like St. Dorotheos, say we're going to receive these who've been charged and have taught heresy? We're going to receive them without ordaining them or baptizing them. What were they? Were they condemned by an ecumenical council? Were they condemned by a council, or were they never condemned? That's hugely important. And as you've heard me say many times here, that's one of the distinctions that the far right, I hate to say that phrase, it's not really accurate, but in any case, those who are among the zealots and the old calendarists, they don't get that distinction either. Why is it so? It's so important. So you have basically the two on the right and the left that are not following the royal path. They both don't get this distinction. Why is this so important? Hugely important. This is where Voulismas is saying you've got to pay attention here. The implications are massive. All right, we're going to hopefully explain that tonight, but if we don't, we'll come back to it in future podcasts. So again, they disagreed as to what was the exact historical canonical background of the witness cases of Economia, and not as to what was the appropriate stance against the heretics of their time, since, with regard to the burning issue of that time, the issue of the baptism and priesthood of the Latins and of the heretics that sprang from them, the positions of both Voulismas and the Kollyvades Fathers, as will be shown in the book, he's talking early on in the commentary, identical from the outset. You will be convinced tonight that they had the same exact position from the outset with documentation. And Voulismas did zero to change that position of St. Nicodemus on the question of papal mysteries. Now, in the article translated into English by Professor Yangou, we noticed a translation of a key excerpt from St. Nicodemus' letter to Voulismas. It's actually, I think, letter 3. And let me see if I can actually get someone to bring it, because it's in the other room and I don't want to get up and leave you all. So just one second. There we go. So we have the translation we read there, and then we said, let's go look at the Greek. This translation seems really strange. Seems odd. And we did our own translation from the Greek. And so we're going to read those two, and you're going to see the big difference and why it's very important that it's retranslated in Professor Yangou's article. Now, I don't know. I didn't see his Greek article. I was looking at the English article, but this is actually from St. Nicodemus. So they're translating St. Nicodemus' letter here, and it's really butchered, unfortunately. So let's see it. It's important because anybody who's interested in researching this, they're going to want to see the proper and true Greek represented. So, does the Church's sacred perfection, that is Dorotheos Voulismas, this is St. Nicodemus, okay? He's answering Father Dorotheos, who was saying, look, you've got to pay attention here to these distinctions. When were these various heretics received without ordination, and when were they not received? And they had to be baptized or ordained again. There is a criteria, he says. Pay attention to the criteria. There's the criteria basically in 2 words is condemned or uncondemned. All right. And it's vastly important. That's the conciliar nature of the church, and the implications of a conciliar decision are massive. Without those conciliar decisions, there is no authority to say that these are outside the church. So we have had many times, and we have today, heretics who are preaching from the ambo. Heretics who are in the positions of the first bishops in local churches. They are teaching heresy. And yet, no one, even among those who don't understand this criteria or don't accept the criteria, will say that the ordinations or the mysteries before a synodical condemnation are not legitimate, are not acceptable, right? And they will not require them to be reordained if they, for instance, separate themselves from the church, and then there's reconciliation. They can be received, of course, without being reordained. Just like we don't baptize somebody who's baptized in the Orthodox Church. We don't go and baptize them again. So this is the distinction they're talking about. Very important for the struggle against the pan-heresy of ecumenism. Very important for understanding of when and how and what basic, you're going to hear me say this again and again. The whole question here is, what are the presuppositions? What is the criteria? What are the preconditions for doing this or that pastoral economia? It's not a free-for-all. It's not whatever you like. And this is Voulismas, very wise. I mean, instead of saying Voulismas was this implying and almost saying, Professor Yangou was implying, well, this Voulismas was kind of a bad character who brought in this fanatical, rigorous position, and it was a politically driven nonsense. Forgive me, Professor Yangou, but it's nonsense what you're talking about. He was beloved of the saints. He was a holy man himself. He was a teacher of the church. He was respected by the hierarchs. It's so sad to see this polarization and to sit now in the 21st century and to look back 250 years and to say, well, he was driven by political considerations and they were actually driven by pastoral considerations, is really unfortunate. It's really unfortunate because it divides unnecessarily those who were united then and now. And so it's a divisive and an unorthodox approach to understanding these men. They were beloved. So he says, St. Nicodemus, so there's a church's sacred perfection. It's a beautiful term, of flattery for Dorotheos Voulismas. Want those heretics to be made to stand blameless. This is the translation that we found in the Yangou article. But that's not at all what it says. It doesn't say blameless. I'll read the full sentence on the left and the full sentence on the right. Whose ordinations and baptism the church once accepted by economy. Okay? In our translation, which we believe is closer to the Greek, so does her sacred perfection, the church's sacred perfection, there's no term ecclesia in the Greek, i.e. you, Voulismas, he's talking to Voulismas, St. Nicodemus, want those heretics whose ordinations and baptism the church once accepted by economia to have been uncondemned, unexcellinti, without being, let's say, condemned is one possible translation, but it's certainly without being checked, without being rejected, essentially, without being judged negatively. And so that's one error. But the next one is really different. He goes, I'm going on in the left column now. And it says, and isn't the principle of economy sufficient to harmonize those holy fathers who were accepted? Total butchering of the Greek. It's not talking about holy fathers who were accepted. Not talking at all about holy fathers who were accepted. With those who were not accepted, according to the principle of precision, what's the Greek say? And is the principle of economia not sufficient to harmonize the holy fathers that accepted these things? Not that were accepted. The holy fathers weren't accepted. The holy fathers were accepting these heretics or these on this basis, right? And the economia on this basis. The holy fathers that accepted these things with those that did not accept them according to the principle of exactitude. Forgive the typos. We're rushing to get everything ready tonight. So again, is the principle of economia, what is it? I'm assuming a lot of knowledge, forgive me. The principle of economia is that with a few words, in my own words here, economia, what does it mean? The management of the household. Ecos nomos, the law of the house. But it really refers to the manager and the management of the household of faith. All right. So we're talking about divine economy. This is the great economy, economia of salvation, the master, the Lord, and his plan and his management for our salvation. That's where we get the term economia. Now that's applied very rightly to the body of Christ, to Christ in the body of Christ through his shepherds, working out like he did after we fell, right? The Kollyvades would have been Adam and Eve stayed in heaven, but they fell. So now he comes and he gives us the salvation in this setting of less than perfect, like we've fallen. Now the church does the same thing, goes into the world. The Lord continues his incarnation. The Lord continues to walk through his church and guide his church and speak through his church, through his saints and through his shepherds. And he is the manager of our salvation. Well, in this context, obviously, the akrivia, the exactitude, is not always applicable because there's a variety of circumstances, and so there has to be the power and the authority and the wisdom and ability of the shepherd to apply the principles and apply the solution of salvation in each case, so that they might make progress in communion with God. And so obviously that's can never be taken away from the church or the shepherds, because it's Christ who's doing that, right? I mean, if it's Christ, that's the question. Are these men in every age, these bishops, are they following the Holy Fathers and applying the economia and working out the salvation of the people? That should not be a given. It's not automatic. Every generation has those who do it and don't do it. those who are heretics or schismatics are just unworthy, and those who are worthy. So we always have to be vigilant. But this is the ideal. This is what the bishops and the priests are called to manage the household of faith and bring about. The great example, I think, that shows the economy of salvation and the akrivia of salvation in our Lord's own life is, of course, that he teaches on the one hand, you must be baptized, you must have faith and the water of baptism to be saved. No comma in that context in the scriptures. And yet he goes to the thief on the cross and he says, today you'll be with me in paradise, who was unbaptized, according to the baptism of water. But he was impossible for him to be baptized. And so the economy of salvation, the need is great, and the reason is based on the great confession of faith of the man. And we have examples of those who were immediately never baptized, but were immediately baptized in the blood of martyrdom. So that's the economy of salvation, right? The akrivia and the economia. Now he says, rhetorical question: is the principle of economia not sufficient to harmonize the Holy Fathers that accepted these things with those that did not accept them according to the principle of exactitude, missing of in both cases? All right, different, and you can't understand what the translation that was in the Yangou article is saying. It's totally misunderstood the Greek. And then the great humility and love. Bless, Father. Let it be blessed. That's an Athonite monastic term. It's basically saying, let it be blessed. Let it be blessed. Let them stand uncondemned according to your wisdom. Right? He's deferring to Voulismas. He's not countering Voulismas. He's saying, my brother and co-struggler, let it be blessed. I don't have a problem. I don't have a problem with what you say. He doesn't have a problem because they're in agreement. Does he? In other words, do you? Because he's referring to him in the third person. Do you? I'm reading from my translation here on the right. Do you desire that the canons not impede the uncondemned priests? In other words, the canons not stand in the way, and for them to be economized. Bless, Father. Let it be blessed. Let them let them stand unimpeded. There's no obstacle for them. For such men, so he's not nitpicking. But he's not opposing either. He doesn't have any problem with Voulismas' criteria. And we're going to explain a little bit further exactly the criteria because they're very important. And you're going to see that he was extremely wise and that what he feared is happening today. Pay attention. What he feared and what he was saying to St. Nicodemus, if we don't pay attention to this criteria and these presuppositions, there's a grave danger. We're going to talk about them in a second. What are the danger? We're living the danger. We're living the problems that Voulismas saw would come about if we don't pay attention as shepherds of the church. But St. Nicodemus says, you know what? For me, I'm okay. I don't want to even argue about this. He says, for such matters are unworthy even of mention and contentiousness. I don't want to argue about these things. Since on their own, they are inferior and worthless. In other words, they're not the meat of the matter, right? I'm not gonna get bent out of shape on these. This interpretive key and exactly how you want to see it applied is acceptable, but it's not for me. It's not the most important thing. I'm not going to argue with you. Let it be blessed. That's what a monk does. That's what St. Nicodemus was saying here. And here we have Yangou presented as him standing against Voulismas and then getting beat down by Voulismas. Oh, he had to accept this tyrant from Constantinople, forced him to accept that which he doesn't believe, which is an insult. It's an insult to St. Nicodemus to say he doesn't believe this. All right, now some commentary here. This date of this letter, by the way, is September 17th, 1792. All right, so this is toward the end of his writing, essentially, of the preparing the book for publication, but it has to go through a long process of review, and then it unfortunately went through many years of practical problems before it could be ultimately printed. So St. Nicodemus had explained cases of ordinations done by heretics being accepted by the fathers by saying this was done by Economia. In other words, St. Nicodemus said, I don't have a problem just to say it's God's economy. Like, in other words, and it's very interesting because if you go to the canons that have to deal with the reception of converts, there is almost never what we say in Greek, etiologia, a reason given. They don't say, oh, in these particular heretics, we're going to receive them by chrismation because, and then they cite some theological teaching they have. Whereas in contemporary Orthodoxy, you find, especially in the Russian Orthodox world, unfortunately, you find this idea that, oh, we receive those who are closer to us by confession of faith and those who are further from us by baptism. Totally unsubstantiated in any consistent reading of the canons. And so that's St. Nicodemus is saying that's the spirit of the canons. We don't need to give an apology to anybody how we received anyone. And if Christ is truly inspiring and guiding us, he didn't sit there and explain why and how he's going to receive the thief or the martyrs, or why he rained down the Holy Spirit on Cornelius and then they baptized them. Like these things are in the economy of salvation, right? So he's rather simplistic in a good way, right? Voulismas, however, thinks this is not enough. This is too uncertain. He wishes to clarify and emphasize that those ordinations which the fathers accepted by Economia were ordinations performed by heretics that had not yet been condemned. Those are the ones they accepted. In other words, he wishes to highlight the prerequisites and bounds and context of Economia, lest it become a bed seed for innovation. That's my expression here. That's not his. And I think this is really wise. I think this is exactly what we're living through. And Voulismas was extremely wise and perceptive, very bright, but also very experienced. Remember, as you're going to learn, he was very well read and also very well traveled. Very well traveled. He saw what he's talking about. He saw the pastoral reality on the ground. He went to many of the Slavic countries in the Balkans. He was in Bulgaria. He traveled. He preached. He taught. He knew what he was talking about. Now, there's a footnote from Elder Nikodemos Barusis about this. I'm going to read it because it's very wise as well. Listen to what he says. Bless, Father, let them stand uncondemned. That's the section he's got a little footnote to. That's what we're talking about. He says, it seems that St. Nicodemus was favoring a more simplistic interpretation of the acceptance of the mysteries of the heretics by Economia. He thought it sufficient to emphasize that Economia is only applied in rare cases of urgent necessity, which, however, do not introduce a binding precedent, nor do they relativize the diachronic validity of the holy canons. All right? He thought it sufficient to emphasize that Economia is only applied in rare cases of urgent necessity, which, however, do not introduce a binding precedent, nor do they relativize the diachronic validity of the holy canons. All right? So in every case, whether you're talking about St. Nicodemus or Voulismas, that's certainly the case, right? Economia is rare, it's urgent, it's needful. There's no precedent set. This is oftentimes not understood by people today. Economia sets no precedent, zero. Nor do they relativize the diachronic validity of the holy canons. So he's saying, look, they cannot undermine the holy canons, period. It's not possible because of these reasons. All right. So St. Nicodemus is just it's simple, it's straightforward. So as soon as the particular circumstances that necessitated the application of Economia pass away, the validity of the canonical exactitude remains undiminished. Right? Are we following here? It's getting too technical for you all. Forgive me. So it's very important because if you're following ecclesiastical events, if you're paying attention to what happens in many ways in the Ukrainian schism or in the reception of converts or in the vesting of priests in Russia, this is all very relevant, right? This is extremely relevant to how the shepherds and the priests are going to guide and properly understand the guiding of the faithful. If you ignore these things, you will have, as you increasingly do, Economia become the rule. Economia become the rule. And of course, that will undo the canons, undo the Ecclesia, and it will be very detrimental, certainly according to St. Nicodemus and Dorotheos Voulismas. Now he says, Dorotheos Voulismas now. Okay, that's St. Nicodemus's summary of what his stance is. Dorotheos Voulismas, however, considered that as much as such a simplistic version of Economia may rightly emphasize the the diachronic validity of the canonical exactitude. All right. So he's saying, yeah, this approach that you have, say Nikodemos, it does emphasize to a certain degree, and rightly, there is a exactitude. You're not, and he's very clear in his canon, Canon 46, his commentary. He's saying there's, on the one hand you have Economia, on the one hand you have Economia. This is how the church is governed. So that's fine. However, it inevitably leads to the offhand diachronic relativization thereof. All right. So inevitably there's a problem. There's a relativization when we don't define the boundaries of Economia, because it does not point out the exact criterion of harmonizing the theology of the holy canons with their Economia. So he's saying you don't want to go there and get into the nitty-gritty of history and say, in what case is this, what case is that? That's fine. You are definitely within the right interpretive key of Economy and Economia, how we operate. However, there's this problem, because you've got to show how theology and Economia harmonize. Now, Economia and theology are going to harmonize, but they're not always going to be like a mathematical, continuation, right? We'll talk about that, because the application, it's going to be in the same spirit of always for the salvation of man, and based on the gospel, and based on the commandments, and based on the canons. Not going to be against, not going to undermine that, right? So when you see, I'm getting ahead of myself, but to apply this, I think what he's saying is that if you become indifferent to the nature of the baptism, what is a baptism? Of course, for the saints, Saint Nicodemus, it means immersion. Well, that's not important. Right? It's just water. This is what Aquinas says, right? Just water. And many Orthodox, unfortunately, are increasingly saying just water. You can be immersed, you can be sprinkled, you can be poured. Not a problem. We're talking about without any kind of economia necessary, right? Well, when you do that, you've now detached the economia from theology. You're saying there's no longer a basis for the economia. Like, economia on what basis? Well, as they all say, including Saint Nicodemus, there's got to be the immersion. There's got to be the type. There's got to be the form. They cannot abandon that among the heterodox. Otherwise, we're undermining what it means. We're undermining the very basic, what it means to be baptized. We're undermining the mystery itself. And so we're no longer harmonizing theology and economia. That's my interpretation of what's going on. It's an application, but let's continue to hear Elder Nicodemus and what he has to say. The lack of this criterion, according to Voulismas, leads to arbitrariness in the application of economia, since the subjectiveness in evaluating every necessity, right? So I'm just a priest, I'm a bishop, and it's a subjective thing. Oh, I think it's necessary. Let's do economia. He says this is just totally too subjective. It's going to become chaos. It's going to be, we're going to lose ourselves here. The bishops and priests and everyone has to have some criteria and some boundaries to the economia, right? But if you just leave it up to everyone subjectively saying necessity here, necessity here, what happens? We're living that, brothers and sisters. We hear economia all the time. And it's anything but economia. It's anything but economia, all right? He goes on. Since the subjectiveness in evaluating every necessity and the consequent arbitrariness in the bounds of mitigation of exactitude gradually formulate a lawless custom. All right, so custom, he saw what was going on in Eastern Europe. He was traveling around Eastern Europe. He was teaching and preaching, and he knew several languages, and he was going and talking to people, and he was seeing, as you'll see later on, that's why St. Paisius loved him, and he published his works, because St. Paisius was fighting against heterodox ideas around the mystery of baptism. And they were seeing the erosion of the dogmatic consciousness of the people, right? And he was saying, what happens is, over time, this arbitrariness leads to people to the erosion of exactitude, the criteria of exactitude, and there's a custom. Oh, this is how we do things in our village. This is how we do things in the Bulgarian Orthodox Church or the Russian Orthodox Church or whatever. That's how I've been doing it. We've been doing it for 1,000 years, right? Oh, we did this from the time of Peter the Great. There are four, and it's on the level of a tradition, but it's not a holy tradition based. I'm talking theoretically, right? I'm not talking particularly about any particular practice. I'm just saying this is what he's trying to say. He's trying to say this leaves too much room open for something to develop a practice, which will then be basically elevated to a tradition, what he's calling a custom in a negative sense, and it will undermine the akrivia of the church, which in practice, he goes on, which in practice substitutes the exactitude of the holy canons and deprives the pastoral condescension of the church of its sociologically necessary theological foundation. Brilliant, in my opinion, is brilliant. All right, this is hard for some of you. You're like, what is he talking about, right? I know some of you out there, okay, bear with me. We're going to go through a lot more, and we're going to embed this. We're going to embed this, all right? We'll come back. Now, in the article, by the way, my son brought me this. I had left it in the room. This is the book with all the correspondence. I've shown this before in the podcast. This is the book. Let's see if we can get it. I don't know. It's hard to see it, isn't it? Yeah. Anyway. All right. This is the book by Elder Nikodemos Voulismas of the monastery of Kollyvades. Not a good pronunciation. Sorry. Cox, Father John Cox, God bless you, Father John, for your love of truth. You say, and I'm repeating what we've already read, and I want you to listen to what Voulismas says. Then I want you to think, not Father John, but all of us, think, is it accurate to say that St. Nicodemus was compelled by Patriarch Neophytos to adjust the text of the Rudder to the satisfaction of Voulismas, or it would not be printed? Is that actually accurate? And what are the implications of that? It seems to me the implications are that basically, it's like blackmail. Are we saying that these men of the church were blackmailing St. Nicodemus? Were we saying that Voulismas, which was his brother in Christ and co-worker in many ways, would want to impose his total will on St. Nicodemus and not work with him? Let's see what they say in their letters. Let's see what their exchange is. Listen to this. This is Father Dorotheos. My dear one, may God forgive you and enlighten you to cry out, bless Father, not in accordance with my own will, for my own is subject to various mistakes at various times, both in knowledge and in ignorance. All right? Remember what we read earlier, and that was the commentary of Father Nikodemos Voulismas, and that was how he responded earlier. Bless Father, whatever you want. And he was saying, let it be blessed, Father Dorotheos, out of humility and love. And he says, not in accordance with my own will, but rather in accordance with the infallible will of the Holy Church of our Christ. Likewise, may he forgive you as well for this great and ineffable mercy, and enlighten me to speak and judge and write in accordance with this self-same mercy. For what I spoke, judged, wrote concerning your book given to me by his all holiness the Patriarch, it seemed good to me to speak and to judge and to write those things in accordance with this same mercy, speaking with great exactness about those things which are for you lowly and worthless. Remember, he said these things are things we have to argue about, right? He was saying that this is not the meat and potatoes of this. I agree. Let it be blessed. He was saying. He's saying these things are worthy of great exactness. Okay. And you say it's just lowly and worthy, but this is actually, I believe these things are great, and we must, have the mercy of God in order for us to understand these things with great exactness, so that the things both of exactitude and of economia may be both preserved invulnerable and confirmed by the church as you requested. Now listen to this. As you requested, it's referring to apparently, according to Father Nikodemos Voulismas, in the existence of a missing epistle of St. Nicodemus, probably accompanying the manuscript of the Rudder that was sent for judgment. This is an important witness to the deeper intent of St. Nicodemus during the composition of the Rudder. His intent was with not a constant support of economia. That was not his intent. His intent was not a constant support of economia, as some claim today, and he's referring here to Yangou. Okay, So Yangou presents it very, one-sided. Nicodemus he was for economia. No, that was not the intent of St. Nicodemus, but rather the enshrinement both of exactitude and of canonical economia. All right, so as you requested, this is what we're doing. So you've already written me, and I'm telling you, this is what we got to do to keep the exactitude and the economia as invulnerable and confirmed by the church. So from the beginning, St. Nicodemus is on the same page with Voulismas. These things, alas, custom briefly canceled, and woe, it holds invalidity as exactitude. When they write, this is difficult language, very difficult language, and it's compact. It's got so much meaning in one sentence. These things, he's talking about, alas, custom briefly canceled. All right, what are these things? The things of akrivia and economia. What's he saying? Custom, it's a negative word for him. It's basically a theologically less and void of theological content practice, which is not in agreement with the akrivia and of the canons and of the gospel. He's saying this custom canceled briefly, and woe, it holds invalidity as exactitude. It holds up something that's totally invalid as exactitude. Sound familiar? Sound familiar, folks? We're living through the same thing today. But since it did not seem so to you, as you exclaim, do you wish, at everything, and then adding, blessed Father, it is clear that when you write this, it is not the things of the disposition serving you, but rather the things of violence, as if we were some violent men or tyrants or other young taskmasters, away with such barbaric savagery. So, Professor Yangou, your implications, he's answered them. St. Nicodemus, his dispositions have been answered. They are brothers in Christ. And he's saying, away with such an exchange where you think, or the implication is that I'm going to pressure you to do anything, right? So on the one hand, you have great humility of St. Nicodemus. On the other hand, you have great love of exactitude of Father Dorotheos. And together, with the Spirit of God and the judgment of all the brethren and the Holy Synod, you're going to find the path to a totally orthodox exposition of the question. Now, a footnote from Father Nicodemus here. The phrase of Voulismas clearly shows that his intent was to persuade St. Nicodemus regarding the correctness of his critical observations, not to impose his own positions upon him. And by the way, this letter is dated March 24th, 1793. Things took time back in those days to get back and forth. Now, Father Nicodemus ends this part of our discussion for us, and then we're going to go on to some other things, talk about a little bit about Father Dorotheos and who he was, very important, with the following comments. This book belongs to the church. That's the words of St. Nicodemus. This book belongs to the church. Needless to say, Father Nicodemus comments, in the hypothetical case, which we've rejected, that the published form of St. Nicodemus' comment on the 46th Apostolic Canon, that's the supposed comment that was forced upon him and it wasn't his own, was the product of a readjustment on the basis of the examination of the book by Voulismas, this would in no wise lessen its value. Okay, so even if Yangou is right, which he's not, it doesn't matter because why? It does not in any way lessen its value and the given authority of the Rudder. So what we're interested in is the authority of the Rudder, right? That's the most important thing because that book has been the foundation of so much for the last 200 years, and it still should be. It's the canons of the church and the commentary of the church ultimately. Right? This belongs to the church. It doesn't belong to St. Nicodemus. It belongs to the church. And that's why it's submitted for review. It's not submitted for review because we have some kind of agenda. It's not like today's Constantinople, forgive me. It was a different Constantinople where you had saints still working and reviewing things when they were sent to them. Let's go. The lesson is value and given authority of the Rudder, since this precisely was the aim of its submission to the infallible criterion of the great church of Christ. In Christophorus' words, right? Christophorus was the author of the other text we're going to see tonight, the collection of canons that he was producing, which is largely from the Rudder itself. so that with her supreme authority, the church might judge it and confirm it, since this book belongs first to the church, St. Nicodemus' own words. So, in such a hypothetical case, the views of St. Nicodemus being corrected, his own words would apply. Now, we're going to apply the words of St. Nicodemus to the idea that he's being corrected, and that this is not something that we should be at all uneasy about. Quote, "It does not concern us what some of the fathers have said or thought," St. Nicodemus, "but rather what says Scripture and the ecumenical councils and the common view, the consensus patrum, the common view of the fathers. For a dogma is not constituted the opinion of some within the church," all right? So the opinion of some does not make for the church dogma, but what the Scriptures, the ecumenical councils, and the common view of the fathers. So even in the worst case scenario, which is not true, which we're going to show is not true very clearly, it is still an expression of the church. It's the book belongs to the church. Now, we've been talking a lot about Father Dorotheos Voulismas, and unfortunately, because of the words and writings of some, they consider him some kind of tyrant or villain or I don't know what. Let's learn about him a bit, and then we'll see how mistaken that view is. He was born in Ithaca in 1738, son of a priest with many children. All right, so comes from a priestly family. He studied in Smyrna, as many did, exceptionally well educated. His classmate and lifelong friend, this is very important, was Agapios Leonard, one of the authors of the Rudder. All right, so they were lifelong good friends. The one who was working with St. Nicodemus. The name, the authorship of the book of the Rudder, the Medallion, the Book of Canons, is not just St. Nicodemus. It's also Agapios. All right, so he was lifelong friends. This is not some strange man they never heard about coming from the Patriarchate with some agenda. This is a friend from childhood. All right, served the Patriarchate of Jerusalem for over a year, and then he went to Constantinople. He was actually a cleric of the holy tomb of Christ, the Yangou Tafitiki Adolfotita. He was assigned the preacher of the great church, a wonderful position with a lot of authority and a lot of responsibility. He suffered from tuberculosis since the age of 33. All right, he died at 81. So for 52 years, he was an ascetic struggling against tuberculosis, not a small thing. Traveled extensively throughout Greece, preaching to the people, much like St. Cosmas de Aetolos, all right, the Aetolian. So he's imitating the saints. He's preaching, teaching throughout Greece. And not just Greece. He went to Bulgaria. He went to Serbia. Suffered various persecutions and trials, as many saints do, which he bore with exemplary patience. Was never discouraged or lost his zeal for founding schools and publishing books. Many times his books would not come to publication. He had many challenges. He never gave up. Struggled against the modernistic currents of his age to the end of his life. He was a confessor of the faith. He was struggling against the erosions of the church life, secularism of his day. A friend and eminent churchman of the time, Nikiforos Theotokis and Evgenios Vougaris, famous and important intellectual of the 18th century. And here's what I want to focus on, St. Paisios Veletskovsky, who all highly esteemed him. Do we understand what that means? They all held him in high regard. St. Paisios Veletskovsky loved him. He was going to become a monk in his monastery. He wanted to die with St. Paisios up in Moldavia. Lived his last days in poverty and much suffering due to old age and illness. He reposed on April 3rd, 1819, at age 81. His dying words were, "The noble Joseph taking down an immaculate body down from the tree." All right. His relationship now with the Kollyvades Fathers, often cooperated and collaborated with them. So with St. Makarios Notaris, St. Athanasius of Paros, St. Nikiforos of Chios, Christophoros Prodromitis, the author of the other canonical text we're going to see, and St. Nicodemus Hagiorite. So again, this idea that he was shouting down commands as some political extension of some political agenda in Constantinople is absurd. It's absurd. Highly esteemed the hesychastic life, had a desire to live out the last years of his life, either with St. Nicodemus or with St. Paisios in Niamps. St. Athanasius of Paros and St. Makarios Noteros supported Voulismas in his struggle against the Greek Enlightenment, which means essentially Western secularization, intellectual and otherwise, in Greece at the time. So this is not a man who's outside the circles or in any way opposed, in any way opposed to the Kollyvades Fathers and their whole work. So as one of many, because this book is massive, right? How many pages was the book? I forget. 1,050 pages. All right. So it's going to be maybe 3 parts or 4 parts before we get through all the points that need to be made from this book. Voulismas' treatise. Now, Voulismas wrote a treatise, a spudasma, on this question, right? He wasn't just somebody who had some points to make. He wrote a whole treatise on it. Like, he was well versed. Saint Nicodemus did well to listen to him. He was not somebody who just passed by and thought for a week or two about this topic. And it was called A Treatise Regarding the Need to Baptize Heretics that have not been baptized in accordance with each of the Lord's commandments. That is, both the one before the resurrection and the one after the resurrection. That's the title of the book. They always had long titles back in the day. If God wills, and we have the right translator, we will translate this and publish this one day. I don't know when. We've got a lot of projects, but it will come out eventually. Now, it is in total agreement with St. Paisios. And listen to how do we know all this? St. Paisios Voulismas, one of the greatest saints of the last 300 years. Rejuvenate, you must know about St. Paisios. If you don't, look him up. It's worthy of your time. I wish Father Seraphim Rose's life from St. Herman of Alaska was still in circulation. It's everybody should be reading it. Hugely important saint, St. Paisios Voulismas. Of course, the great renewer of the hesychastic movement in all of the Slavic lands, and the conveyor of the Holy Tradition, himself a massive and towering figure of monastic life in Romania. Let's see now. This text, this treatise, proves that triple immersion is a necessary prerequisite for the acceptance of the baptism of the schismatics or heretics by Economia, right? By Economia. If a convert can be accepted with chrismation alone, only without baptism, only if he was immersed by triple immersion by the heterodox. That's what that means. In other words, when people talk about katekonomia and we recognize or we accept a baptism, it's always in this context. It's talking about the actual physical side of the mystery. There's no way it can be interpreted as a spiritual content in the heretical or heterodox mysteries. It's totally opposed to the Orthodox ecclesiology. It's impossible for us to think in terms of a mystery outside the mystery. Our whole ecclesiology, from St. Basil, St. Cyprian, St. Basil, all the way down, certainly to the Athanite Fathers, to this day, is in that context. This idea, by the way, it's a whole other podcast someday. This idea that St. Cyprian's ecclesiology, in its basic form, is not the ecclesiology of the Orthodox Church, also needs to be refuted. It's baseless. The application, of course, needs to be discussed, why and how and when, but the basic core is repeated again and again and again. It's the given. It's in St. Paul's teachings. It's in St. Ignatius' teachings. It's the given, but that's another podcast. So in this treatise, the arguments to the contrary are systematically refuted. All right, and this was written before the examination of the rudder. Father Dorotheos wrote this before he took the rudder into his hands, this text. And so again, he's saying there is presupposition for economia. It is that they must be triple immersed. They must maintain the form. In other words, they must be baptized. We're talking about the physical side of the mystery. So this came out, he wrote this on the occasion of basically 3 things. The controversy regarding the baptism of the Latins, not just because the Latins and the Orthodox, between us and the Latins, but also between us and the Latin-minded. All right, so he's writing this because there are Latin-minded people in his day who are mistaken about this topic. Also, Voulismas noted in his missionary journeys in both Greek and Slavic-speaking lands Many Orthodox clergymen were not baptizing properly. Still aren't in many places because of ignorance and the papist propaganda. So again, pastorally, he's driven, as was St. Paisios. And that's why they collaborated so well. And there was a third, more specific reason that had to do with St. Paisios Voulismas. While the practice of the Russian Church since that time was to accept the Latins and the Protestants by chrismation alone, by Economia, St. Paisios, on the contrary, would baptize Lutherans, Calvinists, Papists, and Uniates, since they have not a single immersion, coming as ones wholly unbaptized. All right, so St. Paisios, who was like a spiritual father to him, and he, again, was considering, before he got sick, to run and end his life at the monastery with St. Paisios, leave the Patriarchate and go live in the mountains with St. Paisios. St. Paisios wanted him to write this. St. Paisios wanted his support in his insistence on reception by baptism for all of the Uniates and the others coming to him in Romania. Troubled by the inconsistency of the various local churches and their manner of receiving converts, St. Paisios asked Father Dorotheos Voulismas to write a treatise on the need to baptize the Latins. Voulismas wrote this treatise and sent it to Niams. St. Paisios was so excited by this work that he had some of his disciples translated into Romanian immediately. It was at the end of his life. It was almost on his deathbed. And it was distributed widely, bringing about the desired effect. This is now a quote from essentially a summary of what Father Nikodemos Barousis says in the book. We have wonderful material also about St. Paisios. All right, so that is not insignificant. You might say, well, that's St. Paisios, but this is who Voulismas was. He was a disciple and a friend of the saints, and the saints were all in agreement. Now, we come to something very important, because the claim here is that Voulismas changed the mind of Nikodemos, or forced him to change his mind, and he ended up writing what he wrote in the Rudder, not because he believed it, but because he wanted to get his book published, all right? If that was the case, before Voulismas, Father Dorotheos came and started the exchange with St. Nicodemus, we would have seen in earlier versions a different picture, right? We would have seen a different picture because Voulismas got the book after it had been written. So in the earlier manuscripts, which we have, essentially, we have almost the entire manuscript in, as you'll see in a minute, in many, many passages, we see that he had the same view as in the Rudder in the final form, which totally disproves Professor Yangou's ideas about Saint Nicodemus. So there is another book called the Canonicon, all right? His good friend, Saint Nicodemus' good friend, Christophoros Prodromitis, helped him when the latter was composing his Canonicon. All right, Saint Nicodemus helped Christophoros to compose his own collection of canons and text on the canons. And when the publication of the Rudder was being delayed, Saint Nicodemus generously gave to Christophoros much material from his own yet unpublished Rudder to enrich his Canonicon with it. All right, so we have how much? Just how much? Many parallel passages between the Rudder and the Canonicon. There are many, many. Of the 1,304 interpretive comments of Christophoros in his Canonicon, more than 900 are taken from the Rudder. Essentially, this is the same book. It's like 70, 80% the same book. All right? Whether they're entirely or loosely or abridged, right? They're in there in the same sentiment. According to Yangou himself, in the publication of the Canonicon, this method of working on the part of Christophoros is useful, in our opinion, in discovering the positions that St. Nicodemus first formulated. So Yangou himself says, we can see what St. Nicodemus really believed in those passages. In other words, by comparing the passages in our published version of the Rudder with their equivalents in the Canonicon, we can determine what the positions of these two fathers were before the examination of Voulismas. This is because the original manuscript of the Canonicon is still extant in the library of St. Pantaleimo's Monastery in Manathos. So regarding the baptism of the Latins, the comment on the 46th Apostolic Canon in the Canonicon is entirely dependent on its equivalent in the Rudder. What does that mean? It's the same views, same text, same ideas. St. Nicodemus didn't change his basic views about what? About the papal baptism, right? Because we said earlier, the problem was not in the contemporary pastoral problems. They were in total agreement. The problem was about the criteria then in the ancient church. The application they totally agreed on. And even the problem they had is very minor in the grand scheme of things, right? The small disagreement that they had. Now, let's actually see two excerpts which shows the total agreement of the Canonicon and the Rudder, which means that the views of St. Nicodemus were consistent. So we read from the Canonicon. Furthermore, as many heretics as were not preserving the kind or the material or the manner of the kind or the material in the baptism, see the note on the 50th apostolic, those ones the fathers of the councils prescribed that they be baptized. All right, so this is St. Nicodemus. Voulismas does not use this language at all. He actually doesn't agree with this reference to kind and material and this kind of thing. The question of ili, as we said earlier here, right? The question of ili, eidos, these are the Greek terms. Voulismas is actually critical of using these terms, but it doesn't matter because St. Nicodemus stuck to those terms and used them in their apparent in the Canonicon and in the Rudder. Deduce then, now this is the Canonicon, right? Deduce then from those things when it is already not the time for Economia, right? So he's saying, look, from these things you can see here, there's when do we not use Economia, right? There is a time when you cannot and you should not use Economia. This is one of the myths going on today. Like, oh, it's whatever we want to do. Anytime Economia. It doesn't matter the presuppositions. There are no presuppositions, right? If the priest wants it, if the bishop decides it, let it be blessed. That's not accurate. The saints are saying, no, there's a time when you should not use Economia. Absolutely off limits. So he says, deduce from this, what I'm talking to you above, the fathers of the councils prescribe that they be baptized in these cases when these things are missing. They've not preserved the kind, the material, or the manner. And he says, deduce from these things when it is already not the time for Economia, and the manner of the material is not kept, and they are heretics. What is to be done? All right, so that's the Canonicon. Now let's go to the Rudder and see, is there any difference? Is there like a different opinion presented in the Rudder? And those heretics whose baptism the councils did not accept counterfeited the ceremony of baptism and corrupted either the manner of the kind, that is to say, of the invocations, or the usage of the material, that is to say, of the immersions and immersions. Same sentiment. Those things cannot be corrupted. Only when that is the case is there a catechonomia, acceptance of the form of baptism, and therefore they don't need to repeat that form. They can be received in the church without repetition of the form of the external ceremony, right? When they don't corrupt it, that's the only time economia is permissible. And he goes on, concerning now, he's applying it now. That's the theoretical. Now he applies it to the Latins. This is in the Rudder. Concerning the Latins' baptism, since economia has passed away, just like he says there, not the time for economia, same sentiment, because they do not keep the three immersions. Again, the manner is not kept, the material is not kept. They corrupted the usage of the material, and as heretics, they are not able to perfect the baptism, and they are heretics, right? Same exact sentiments in both texts, one before Voulismas, the other one after the approval of the Patriarchate. And therefore, the baptism of the Latins is not acceptable. Same exact sentiment. Now, Elder Nicodemus, about these parallel passages, listen to what he has to say. Elder Nicodemus Barousis. The last two excerpts from the comments of Christophoros, quote, furthermore, as many heretics, what is to be done, etc., in that passage, and their equivalents in the Rudder prove incontrovertibly that the two Kollyvades Fathers, St. Nicodemus and Christophoros, in their works, original form as well, before the examination by Voulismas, rejected the application of economia in the case of the Latins, taking their stand clearly in favor of their re-baptism, their baptism. We don't do baptisms twice, but that's a term that's been accepted in certain places. That the positions of the Rudder regarding the need to baptize the Latins belong originally to St. Nicodemus and were not introduced later under Voulismas' influence is also proven by the examination of the latter. The examination was the term used by his paper, his report, let's say, wherein, among other things, he notes the interpreter, St. Nicodemus, in the footnotes of the 46th canon of the Apostles, refuting the baptism of the Latins, both by reason of exactitude and by that of Economia. Pay attention here. Voulismas found this upon examination of the Rudder. That was already there. Before he began to examine, he said, I found this there. The interpreter has stated this. St. Nikodemos stated this. This wasn't Voulismas' imposition. That interpretation is all St. Nikodemos. Father Barusus continues, indeed, the particulars that St. Nikodemos lists in his comment in question constitute the opinion that the baptism of the Latins is a baptism falsely so called, and therefore it is acceptable neither by reason of exactitude nor by the reason of economia. All right? Certainly by exactitude, of course, they're going to be baptized. But can they be received by economia? Are the presuppositions present? No, they're not, according to St. Nicodemus, according to Voulismas, according to St. Paisios, according to St. Athanasius, according. And if we also take into account the pervasive use of the terms material and kind in the comment, the use of which did not find Voulismas in agreement. So we have something that St. Nicodemus uses in his commentary, which Voulismas did not agree to. So this idea that he's a tyrant and he wants total control and he wants everything to be changed before he signs off on it is false. He left that in, even though he didn't agree with it. And also the preservation of the controversial point, which in his examination, Voulismas judged should be corrected, right? We're going to talk about this in a second. Then we are able to support with certainty that the published very extensive comment of the Rudder in the 46th Apostolic Canon is identical with its original manuscript form and absolutely expresses the mindset of St. Nicodemus. There's no doubt that Yangou got it wrong, very wrong. He did not understand what he was reading or something. I don't know what to express. I mean, this is so much evidence. Maybe he didn't see this evidence. I don't know. I hope that in his text, I'm looking forward to seeing his text. I ordered it to be sent to me to see what he says about these things. Let's see what kind of interpretation he gives. But I'm not going to hold my breath because there's overwhelming evidence here that St. Nicodemus did not change and that he was in a total agreement with all the other saints, including St. Paisios and all the rest. Now he continues, Elder Nicodemus, the editor of this collection of letters that we have all the information about the views. This mindset of the saint is confirmed also by his well-known epistle, September 1806, to the Ecumenical Patriarch, St. Gregory V. Now, this is just the last, toward the end of his life, right? He dies in 1809. He has not changed one iota his views from 1790, right? So here he says, in which he writes St. Gregory V, and he says, beseeching him to send a converted Uniate monk from Hungary to the spiritual father of the monastery of Pantocrator, Papa Grigori the Vlach, so that he might catechize and baptize him, because he was baptized, or rather debaptized, and defiled by the Latins' defilement. Okay, so Saint Nicodemus writes the Patriarch the holy higher martyr, in 1806. He's on his way to become a patriarch, second time, I think, and he begs him to baptize a Uniate. So Uniates usually would baptize in Orthodox form. He said, no, we're not even accepting Uniate. He said, baptize him. And he receives a positive response from St. Gregory V, of course. We'll see that in a second. This is the constant view of St. Nicodemus in favor of the baptism of the Latins. It proves also that what was his stance towards the acceptance by Economia of their priesthood. So this is another question that's come out. And this is something that's very relevant to our day. So relevant to what's going on in the Ukraine. You're going to say to me, Father, this is so, I can't follow. This is all so relevant, brothers and sisters, to what they did in the Ukraine. They're trying to create the academic and scholarly apparatus to say it doesn't matter, the presuppositions for Economia. It's a free-for-all, folks. Whatever the bishop says. Not true. Not the saints. The saints didn't teach this. Now listen to this. It's very much calculated for our contemporary. This is what happens. Academics who are in the service of ecumenism are given a task. Support our decision X. Find grounds for supporting our decision in this acceptance of the schismatic Ukrainians, and then this is well known. I mean, professor of ecclesiastical history, his name just escaped me as I'm sitting here. Fidas, yes, thank you, Fidas. Well known for accepting the the request of the Patriarchate and fulfilling them in supporting whatever practice or move they were engaged at the time. And I'm afraid that this might be the case here because it doesn't add up. Actually, Professor Yangou's position on the question of the canonicon of Christophoros in 2008 is very different than his position in 2016. And that's something we can talk about in the future podcasts. So it seems like things drastically change for Professor Yangou as well. And I'm not sure why. So continuing on, the question of the priesthood of heretics, right? What do we do with the priesthood? Because this was also a claim that not only the baptism was the St. Nikodemos, remember the claim up at the top, what Father Cox repeated from, I think, Father Professor Yangou, that not only did he say no problem, Economia for the baptism, but also for the priesthood. So let's see, what is that possible? What did St. Nikodemos say about that question? All right. Although he did not incorporate into the Rudder the distinction between condemned and uncondemned heretics, that was Voulismas's position and desire, and I think it actually is proven to be very wise in our day and important distinction. But in any case, even without the distinction, St. Nicodemus has a different solution for the same problem. As a criterion of the acceptance by Economia of their priesthood, all right? Perhaps lest he fall into the inevitable non sequitur of Voulismas regarding the Latins. Okay, we won't address that, but in any case, it's a speculation why exactly St. Nicodemus did it. Maybe that's the case. Nevertheless, he sets forth the criterion of baptism as a prerequisite for the acceptance of their priesthood. So he says, if the church accepts the baptism, in other words, accepts, does not repeat the form, accepts it because it's been maintained and it's in its fullness, right? The mystery has not been undermined in its form. Well, then it can also consider, and on that's a presupposition, a prerequisite for them to consider the acceptance and not reordaining them, as we have some cases in church history. But again, according to Voulismas, and I think he's right, and there's a lot of evidence to point that he's right, that, for instance, at the Seventh Ecumenical Council, they received the iconoclast bishops without ordaining them because they were never condemned by a synod. They were never condemned by a synod in the Seventh Ecumenical Council. So essentially, they were part of the church, or they had never lost synodically, they'd never been condemned and lost their ordination. So in any case, for St. Nicodemus, it's impossible to accept the idea that we can receive someone's priesthood if we don't accept their baptism. So he emphasizes, St. Nicodemus emphasizes, the iconoclasts and all the other heretics whose ordinations the church once accepted, again, by economy, they accepted them because they'd not been condemned, according to Voulismas' approach, I think he's right, by economia and condescension, and not by exactitude. These, I say, had been baptized properly and in accordance with the form or type of the church. So for St. Nicodemus, that's a presupposition for acceptance of their priesthood and without ordaining them again. Therefore also, just as the church accepted their baptism, thus in turn she accepted also their ordinations. The Latins, however, and those from them, and all their such groups are not properly baptized. Therefore also, just as the Church of Christ does not accept their baptism, which is the first of the mysteries, much more so she does not accept their ordinations. This is, by the way, forgive me, the exact opposite of what some clerics, very high clerics, are saying today is the practice in a Slavic church, where they're doing a practice which is only done in that church and not in the Greek world at all. So the exact opposite position of St. Nicodemus is being carried out in very high-profile ways in the Orthodox Church today. Very relevant. What we're talking to you about is very relevant to the life of the church right now, all over the Orthodox Church. And he finishes, for this reason, it is necessary that they also be baptized and ordained by Orthodox priests and hierarchs. And of course, that's what's happened for the most part in the Greek world up until recently, until the age of ecumenism. That's what was going on. Now we're almost finished. 2 more and we're done, and we can open up to questions. So if you have questions, this is the time to collect them, John, or submit them over in Crowdcast. If you have questions, go over there to the box, ask a question. If not, that's fine. It's a difficult subject. Not everybody's going to have a question. You want to digest it, but I'd be happy to entertain your questions. So, now, if Saint Nicodemus had been so influenced by Voulismas, certainly he would in canon 46. What about all the other references? We have tons of other references in the Rudder. In fact, he was anxious. He was anxious to make sure his readers understood, and remembered, and he would also lose no opportunity of returning and driving home the same point, that the Latin's baptism is not a baptism, immersion at all, right? We're talking about the actual mystery. It doesn't mean baptism. It's not an immersion. This was really important for the saints. We might not understand why this is important today, because frankly, we're infected by a kind of lax attitude toward the actual mystery. We're infected by legalism. We're infected by a approach to the mysteries which is not in the same spirit and ethos as the saints. So that the Latin's baptism is not a baptism at all, but only sprinkling or pouring. That the converts from, that's my addition, that the converts from the Latins need to be baptized, not rebaptized, for they were never baptized. That if the heretics that baptized with one immersion were to be received by baptism, how much more, this is St. Nicodemus' point again and again, how much more so that those that baptize with no immersion, the Latins. So, Elder Abbot Nikodemos Voulismas comments, and he says, so because St. Nicodemus foresaw the possible consequences of what the unpaid defenders of the Latin pseudo-baptism were promoting, all right, he foresaw the possible consequences of what the unpaid defenders of the Latin pseudo-baptism were promoting. For this reason, while composing the Rudder, he would return in season and out of season to the topic of the baptism of the Latins, despite his extensive comment in 46 Apostolic Canon. So he's got a massive comment in 46, and yet he goes in all these other examples, which we're going to see right now, so as to consolidate in his reader the consciousness, the dogmatic consciousness of the necessity of their baptism, and to halt the invigorated pro-Latin current of the Latin-minded Orthodox. So, besides his extensive comment in 46, we also see 7 other references in this subject in the Rudder. 47th Apostolic, 50th Apostolic, 7th Canon of the Second Ecumenical, on page 305 in the Greek, 582, 589, and 618, all in the Greek version. So, is it possible that Voulismas went through the entire Rudder at every single instance? He tweaked it, he perverted it, he distorted it, and St. Nicodemus said, oh, well, I just want to get my book published, I guess. You think that's what happened? I don't think so. Now, before we close, I want you to see the actual letter. It's very interesting. From St. Nicodemus to Patriarch Gregory V, and with that we'll close. And I think this is a pastoral call to all those who want to imitate the saints. This is a pastoral call to all those who want to imitate the saints, to follow St. Nicodemus and to follow St. Gregory. You're a hierarch, you're a hieromonk, you're a priest. This is what you do. This is what you do. If St. Nicodemus did it 250 some odd years ago, 200 years ago, well, how much more today when we have a dissolution, which is far, far greater, and a pastoral need, which is far, far greater, to, in the age of ecumenism, to shore up the boundaries of the church, to shore up the identity of the church, to bring people in and give them the right foundation, and many, many, many other reasons. But here's what he says. My all-holy, most divine, and worshipful Master, the Lord and Ecumenical Patriarch, the carrier of this mine epistle, being by descent from Hungary and by being baptized, or rather debaptized and defiled by the Latins' defilement, comes through me to your all-holy pate, personage, your father, ardently seeking that he be baptized by the Orthodox baptism, by our baptism of the Eastern Church of Christ. Okay? So, clearly saying there is no baptism. He needs to be received only through baptism. There's no options here. Therefore, we beseech both he and I, your Christ-imitating apostolic heart, that by a brief command of yours, ye send the aforementioned unmonkish and uninitiated monk. Okay, he's talking about the uniate. He's talking about a uniate here. He's not talking about a Latin. They baptize. They have, looks like a monastic life, something they're trying to imitate the Orthodox. He's saying they're unmonkish and uninitiated, defiled by the Latin baptism, to the Vlach Papa Gregory, the spiritual father at the monastery of Pantocrator, so that he, as his fellow countryman and speaker of the same language, may initiate and give rebirth to him through the Orthodox, Orthodox baptism, so that both he and I may more extensively pray to God that along with all of the other salvific thoughts, ye may enjoy an auspicious voyage and be prospered along the way to your ecumenical throne. He's leaving Athos and he's going to become the Patriarch of Constantinople at this time, and accomplish imitations, a second time now, and accomplish imitations of the good unto the common benefit of the whole Christian people. Your prayers entreating, I remain proclaimed the least of your slaves, Nikodemos. And he responds, we pray, Sir Nicodemus, on our behalf, act out what you have written. Do what you have said. Patriarch of Constantinople, Gregory. Okay, these are the archives of the Aviron Monastery in Mount Athos. This is the end of part one. And you have seen, I hope, conclusive rebuttal of the idea. I repeat again, the idea, which is not borne out in the text, not borne out in what we know about the saint, about Voulismas, about St. Paisios, about the Rudder. Everything here, all of the evidence points to a grave error on the part of the professor, and it should not be repeated in the English language. I hope that Father John will consider striking that from his article after he sees all this evidence and see that, in fact, there is no grounds for doubting St. Nicodemus's ecclesiology and position on Latin baptism. We're going to continue this discussion. We're going to continue this presentation. We'll have a future podcast, one of these Tuesdays in the future. We'll come back to this and we'll see other aspects that were brought out and discussed in the, not just in Father John Cox's article, not just in Professor Yangou's article, but in other places, other ideas. I've been asked many times over the last, 2 months since it came out, to address an article written by, I don't know who, I don't remember the name now, but it is something about that so-called sacramental rigorism is not traditional, right? There was an article. So I reached out to some colleagues of mine and back in Europe, and we're going to be eventually getting into that. That might take some time. We'll be addressing those points. They're not very convincing at all, and I'm surprised that so many people have been impressed by that article. But there is a great deal of ignorance because they don't have access to the sources. They don't have access to the original Greek. They don't have access to the teachings of the Athenites. And so there's ideas that circulate as Orthodox, but they're essentially just regurgitated. And the basic problem is that they don't start in the right place. They don't start on the right basis, right? And so they end up in a strange lands and strange positions. So tonight we showed conclusively that St. Nicodemus held the same position as Voulismas with very little difference, and it was basically on what criteria we're going to and how we're going to explain essentially the decision of the church and the ancient church to do economy. Right? What are the criteria of economy? That's essentially the only part. And we saw out of his great humility that he wasn't forced, but he willfully and gladly said, I don't have any problem with this. He didn't say, oh, this is terrible. I don't have any problem with this. Let it be blessed, out of his humility. And he did not go, against the suggestions. He actually doubled down in their application today in many ways. But he had his own view, and he, as we saw, rejected the Latin baptism and therefore also the Latin ordinations. There's no doubt about that. In many cases, until the end of his life with St. Gregory V. So hopefully this will put an end to this delusion, and we can focus on following the Holy Fathers and following the saints and not innovating. All right, let's see your questions. We're at 2 hours in, and we've got 5 questions over here and another 5 over here. Let's see what we have. First question. Paisios, do you know if any Serbian saints ever did pouring, sprinkling baptism? Many today claim all Serbian saints baptized and were baptized in this way. You know, I'm not going to venture any guesses. I don't have any hard, fast evidence on Serbian saints and how they were baptized, whether they're baptized properly or not. It seems like this innovation has been given the force of custom, like Voulismas, Father Dorotheos said, it was the grave danger, even back into the 19th century, maybe even earlier. So I would not be surprised if this has been a constant temptation for the church going back. And again, I think it's very clear to me anyway, that this all has roots in the Latinization of our theology during the great, Western captivity that Florovsky talks about, that this was actually one of the gravest victims of that Latinization, which has not been properly addressed. I stand in awe that so great a academic theologian as Florovsky did not get that the rejection of a Crivian Economia is a huge problem. Voulismas got it. St. Nikodemos, others, they understood you cannot walk away from that distinction, that interpretive key. And he rejects it entirely. And he doesn't see it as a Latinization. This creates a lot of question marks in my mind, because it's such a vital question that St. Paisios Voulismas was so determined at the end of his life to make sure that he fought against this innovation. Such a great light of the church, such a saint who was such a great hesychast. How can anyone, especially an academic theologian of stature, not submit to that and say, wait a minute, this is something I need to pay attention to. These are saints of our church, great saints of our church, who are pointing out to us grave danger here if we don't resist the idea that this idea, it doesn't matter if you baptize, pour, sprinkle, and it doesn't matter whether there are criteria for economia, and it's just a subjective application on the part of the priest or of the bishop. These kind of things have led. I mean, there's other reasons as well. All right, this is just one aspect. There are other grave reasons, especially in the humanist ecclesiology, which drives people to not want to baptize the converts, which I think again is a fruit of Latinization in the Orthodox Church. Okay, another question. Why do some jurisdictions follow the Canon 95 in regards to the reception of converts, but others, like Royal Court, does not? Well, part of what you saw was their interpretive key, how they understand the canons, how they understand the criteria. So Canon 95, first of all, just see a few words about Canon 95, but this is not the topic tonight. Just 1 second here. So for everybody who doesn't know Canon 95, Canon 95 is the canon in Trullo, which repeats in part Canon 7 of the Second Ecumenical Council, then adds to it. And I really like, before I say that, so in this canon, they're basically witnessing to the practice of the church in the 5th century, in 4th and 5th century, in Constantinople, but in other places. They're witnessing the practice, the pastoral practice of how to receive certain heretics. And they add to it and update it essentially for other heretics that were not included in the first canon, in the 7th canon of the Second Ecumenical. And now there's several things that could be said. One thing is, how do we properly understand that addition, grammatically and theologically? I think Father Patrick Ramsey has done a really interesting job. I put this in my ecclesiology class when we're talking about these questions. I think it was like the 7th or 8th class. I focused on what he said about Canon 95, which I thought was very important, how to properly interpret that in light of our the consistency that the saints seek out, the interpretive key and the criteria to understand the canons, and not piecemeal, but throughout history. So Canon 95 is a little misunderstood, I think, just to sit down and read it and what was it saying, especially the second part. I won't get into that. Go to Father Patrick in Academia, find his article on Canon 95. You can read it for yourself. I think it's very interesting and needs to be taken seriously. Secondly, and what he's saying, it basically reorients us as to the Monophysites and the Nestorians that need to be baptized. And we have a witness from the church in Georgia a couple hundred years later where they're calling upon all Monophysites to be baptized as well. So there's another, it seems like a lot of potential there academically to research and see, do we have another blind spot? Do we have another misunderstanding of the pastoral practice of the church with regard to reception and what basis and all the rest? But Canon 95 was for those heretics at those times. Obviously, it needs to be applied. That's what the saints were doing, and that's what we were talking about all night. How to apply that to the contemporary heretics. It's not automatic. Oh, we did it with the Arians that way, we'll do it with the Papists this way. That's not at all, that's irrelevant. It's irrelevant because there are different criteria. That's the question is, what are the criteria for the application of Economia? And so the answer to your question is, there's not a consistent and patristic understanding of the criteria for the application of Economia. When and how and what basis we should baptize or we can economize. And that's what St. Nikodemos says in his canon. That's what the saints were insisting on, that they cannot economize today. And Rocor, more or less, I'm not sure the reasoning behind their decision in the 70s, but it sounds like more or less that's what they also understood. Maybe it was pastoral. Maybe they didn't think deeply about the criteria of economy. I don't know. But in practice, that's what comes across is they say there's no basis and presuppositions do not exist for us to economize. Whereas others, in the best case scenario, say, no, we think there is. Now, in those cases, in my experience, their reasoning is simply, we can do it. Or it's in the priest's authority, or the bishops can do it, or we always economize. Look, we've received all these heretics in the past, therefore we can do it again. That's the kind of specious, superficial reasoning that you hear all the time. And it doesn't even approach the saints' approach to this. It doesn't even come anywhere near the thinking of the saints that we just went through the last 2 hours. And it's a tragedy. And I think that's why you end up with, a lot of people getting upset and saying, why wasn't I baptized? Especially when they say, I want to be baptized. Can you imagine somebody, the Hungarian Uniate monk goes to St. Nikodemos. Can you imagine St. Nikodemos saying, you're a Uniate? You pretty much were baptized with the same way. You can just be chrismated. Just chrismated. No, I want to be baptized. You cannot be baptized. That's what people say to converts today. No, it's not possible. It's a total inversion of what the meaning of Economia is. And it's so not like the saints to deny people the bath of immortality in the Orthodox Church. It's absurd. So I think that's what's the problem is that they've lost sight of these criteria and there's not consistent across the board. And then we have even worse things. And there's some cases where there's a total ecumenist mindset. So they just say, look, we believe they're already baptized. We're one church, right? So this is a heretical mindset entirely, totally opposed to the saints. But there's a spectrum of pretty broad spectrum in terms of reasoning, right? There's some who are total ecumenists, and there's some who are strictly trying to follow the saints. And then there's different reasons and different ideas about Economia and the presuppositions across the board. And you just need to, first of all, figure out who you're talking to and what they're thinking about this topic before you start talking, answering their questions, because it could be a variety of thoughts, a variety of ideas. Next question. The Orthodox Apologetics channel, Evologite, I have been looking for that SCOBA document with approved baptisms from like 25 years ago that lists churches accepted. Do you have it? I have seen it. It was published in a SCOBA publication. It's been years since I even it's in my library in Greece somewhere, but I haven't paid much attention to it. I'm not sure. I doubt it's on the internet. So you're going to have to find it in one of those like SCOBA yearbooks from the 1970s or something, or 60s even. It may be on the internet, but I don't think so. I think it was probably following criteria which were not patristic, and it was some kind of well, who's closer to us and what have we done historically and and so there's no, I don't think it's going to add to clarity. Yeah, I think you're right. It's added to confusion. The question is, hasn't it contributed so much to the confusion? Probably. I mean, there wasn't probably much thought to that, and they just came out and said, well, this is what we do. We're fine with this, right? What problems exist with its writing and policy? I don't know. I don't know much about that. I don't even know if they follow that anymore, frankly. I think each jurisdiction has a different criteria today. Paisios asks, I have another question. Is there any saint who ever rejected the whole idea of economia exactitude? Perhaps there might be who don't even work in that context. There might be. Seraphim Hamilton and others today claim this very idea is innovative from the Kollyvades Fathers. Are the Kollyvades the first to exculpate economia exactitude as an explicit concept? Of course not. They're the ones who developed it in these kind of discussions and exchanges that went on for years in their, and it's very understandable why they did that, because they're producing a canonical text for the first time in a long time, and so they're going to go through a lot of work to make sure that they're applying it and they're understanding it properly. But these kind of conversations have been going on since the beginning. You go back to the third century. You've got Saint Firmilian, Saint Cyprian, Saint Dionysius of Alexandria, and they're talking about when and how to receive and why or why not to baptize. Saint Basil the Great, of course, is one of the main pillars of the whole understanding, and he's the one who uses the terms to begin with. And it's certainly totally inconsistent with the saint's interpretation that we're talking about tonight to somehow act as if Saint Basil's not promoting and presenting the very teaching that Saint Nicodemus is presenting in a more basic form without any kind of, elaborate explication, which makes sense because he was writing a letter to a bishop and he was given pastoral directions. He wasn't trying to defend and write some kind of treatise. So, of course, it's been going on from the beginning, this discussion. St. Basil, I think, is one of the most important, if not the most important father, to teach us these criteria. If you look in Canon 47, he says clearly that Rome, on account of some economia, accepts the baptism of the heretics. We, however, will not. And so there's two things that come right away. That he's interpreting Western practice, which in some ways was different and had a different approach in the context of economia. Secondly, that how he understands it, right? He's not saying that they have a different ecclesiology. He's not saying they have a different teaching about the church, but he's saying whatever they're doing it in the realm of economia. In other words, the management of the household. He didn't give it dogmatic weight, whereas in the West, that was the tendency. They didn't understand the latitude of the management of the house as they did in the East, and they had a much more legalistic approach. And so Basil's always looking at it that way, and that's hugely important for us, right? So when we come to other such statements in the West by saints, that's how we have to remember that. Or the decision in Carthage, the second big council in Carthage, and how it's accepted in Trullo, that's the kind of interpretation that was going on in the East, even of those councils. And we have to think about it like that. In other words, it's so important where you begin, on what basis you begin your examination of the practice. You can't go to the practice and then figure out the theology, which so many people do. You're going to make a mess of it. You've got to acquire the mind of what the church is. You've got to go deeply into who Christ is. And then you turn and you say, well, now what is that? The heterodox, the schismatic, how does the church understand itself? And then how does the church understand those who are outside? They're clear teachings from the fathers on that. It's not a guesswork. And only in that context can you then understand the pastoral practice. And so if you go without that, and you're not formed in that, and you start thinking about history and thinking about events, and you say, well, here they chrismated Arians, and there it doesn't matter. That's not a precedent. Saint Nicodemus says it clearly, there's no precedent set by economia. If there is, it's total chaos, right? So the Western legalistic mindset is very difficult to enter into the whole approach of a Saint Nicodemus or Saint Basil, for that matter. So I don't think the Kollyvades are the first to explicate economia exactitude. I think it's right there in St. Basil's canons. I just think that St. Basil wasn't asked to write a treatise on it. He's not going he's not having the same problems and the same discussion that they had in the 18th century. But even so, let's just say they were the first to excommunicate. So what? I don't understand why that is a problem for some people. That should be neither here nor there. Why? Because there are many saints who make statements about things, but there are only a few saints who become the authorities on that topic. Right? Saint Athanasius wrote on the Incarnation. He wasn't the only one to write on the Incarnation. There are many people defending the faith, and yet his text becomes a pillar of the church's understanding on the Incarnation. Or Saint Maximus, or Saint Gregory Palamas on the divine energies. There are many people, saints before him and after him, who've written on it. But we go to him as saying this is the definitive Orthodox understanding. Let's say, right? He really has grasped it. So this is the case throughout church history. There are not going to be thousands of saints or even hundreds of saints who are going to become the authority for the church on this topic. The fact that today the humanist, Western, legalistic, and academic circles reject Nikodemos should be in many ways, a sign that this is so important for the church to embrace, and that this is the church fathers that we need to follow, because they're being attacked. They're being attacked by a legalistic and secular mindset, and they're being called Latinizers. They're being called legalists or whatever it is, but they are the ones that the Lord allowed to speak through, and they've been definitive. This is what people don't get. Though that text and their teaching has been a given in the Greek Orthodox world for 200 years, and no one questions it. No one questions it except those who are innovating and academics and want to try to promote a different agenda, which I think is very clear with the developments in the last since 2016 in Crete and all the rest. It's pretty obvious, trying to defend their decision in the Ukraine with a lot of this. It's all connected. It's not. Now there's all this interest in this. It's intentional. It's intentional to defend the present practice, right? So you say explanation. Their whole argument is basically that the economy, exactitude, interpretation key is an innovation. Well, then that's just amazing to me. So they're going to stand in judgment of a whole host of saints of the church. How do they do that? I just stand in awe that they know better than Saint Nicodemus, Saint Athanasius, Saint Macarius, Saint Paisios, right? They know better than the Athenites today, the Saint Paisios of the Athenites. Yeah, they're going to say, well, we have saints on our end that say other things. Yeah, but are they expressing, and have they been given the authority, and are they expressing the diachronic tradition, or is it just proof texts that people present? That's the question. It's not. I'm not saying that we have more saints saying this and less that. It doesn't matter how many saints are saying each one. The question is, do they express the ecclesiology, the ethos, the pastoral approach of the Orthodox Church? And the Orthodox Church for 200 years, throughout at least the Greek Orthodox-speaking world, has said yes. They glorified Saint Nicodemus. They glorified Saint Paisios. Nobody said, well, yes, but they're delusional. They're innovators. Yes, we can't. St. Nicodemus is great, but he's a total innovator. Whoever said that until 20th century academics who want a different narrative and want to overthrow what has been accepted to this day among our saints? Do we have saints in the last 200 years that turn their backs on St. Nicodemus or St. Paisios or other saints who understood what was at stake and embraced this? I don't think so. And then you say that it's an innovation, and so therefore the reception of Arians, etc., in early church must be interpreted as recognition of heretical sacraments. But okay, as I just said, it's absurd to call them innovators. It's absurd to call the church. It's essentially saying the church has innovated for the last 200 years. Why? Because the ecumenical patriarchate during the Ottoman period in the 19th century was the voice of the Orthodox Church throughout the Greek-speaking world, right? It was the church. And St. Paisios Voulismas became the church father who brought hesychasm back to Russia in large measure. So if you turn around and call them innovators, what are you saying about the church for the last 200 years? That's one question. Secondly, the idea that you have to therefore, that you must interpret early church practice as a per se recognition of heretical sacraments means you must adopt a different ecclesiology, because per se recognition of Arian mysteries means Christ is given and gives himself to the Arian who denies him. Because that's what it means to be baptized. That's what it means to receive the Holy Eucharist. It means Christ is giving himself. Christ is given. He's the one who both is given and gives and imparts and distributes. He's the one that does everything in the mysteries. So are you seriously believe the early church who condemned Arians? St. Athanasius has a whole section there where he rejects the baptism of Arians and other heretics. On what basis can you hold that it's a per se recognition of heretical mysteries when you have saints who clearly say there's nothing, and there's canons that clearly say there's nothing? But beyond that, the ecclesiology of the church doesn't allow for this. How can Christ be divided? Because they were certainly divided. The Arians were condemned by the First Ecumenical Council, and we were still receiving them after the condemnation by chrismation, and not. I mean, the canon in the Second Ecumenical Council says they could be received by chrismation. So, is that really a per se recognition? So, the church has a council, ecumenical council. It's infallible. It condemns the Arians. The Arians come back to the church, or don't even come back to the church. Even though they've been condemned, we still consider them one church with us. Christ is given and gives. Christ is the head of the church, and yet we're totally divided. In fact, we consider them to be like from hell, basically, right? We anathematize them. Their mentality is hellish. It leads people to hell, and yet Christ is given and gives in their mysteries. What is this? This is insanity. Like, who teaches this nonsense, right? I'm sorry, but that does not fit in Orthodox ecclesiology. Even if you want to nuance here and nuance there and go into different avenues of trying to, it's so gross in terms of Orthodox ecclesiology. It's hard to imagine people are serious about it. Father Deacon Andre, professor at Jordanville. This is a question from Manuel Quelle, I guess you say your name. Stated that the two methods of reception were titled the Greek method and the Russian method. Why would we do that? Why would we make that distinction? That makes no sense to me. St. Paisius Veskovsky was not a Greek, and yet he totally adopted the teaching. He asked for and published the writings of Father Dorotheos Voulismas, whose views obviously were consistent with the Kollyvades Fathers in every substantial point. He says the ROCOR adopted the Greek method, and the rest of the jurisdictions adopted the Russian. Can you elaborate on how these two methods have developed? I have no idea what he's talking about in terms. I don't even know that distinction does not. I do not embrace that distinction. There's one Orthodox method, folks. What does that mean? And we're going to legitimize. Are we going to legitimize opposed views of Economia? I don't know. That would have to be unpacked for me to understand what he wants to say. What is the Russian method per se? What is the Greek method? That would have to all be unpacked for me, and then I could comment on it. But I don't know what he's referring to, and why would we even speak like that? And maybe historically, he's trying to say, well, historically, this is what they did in Russia, and historically, this is what they did in Greece. But it's not really true, is it? Because in both places, at least today, in the last 50 years, certainly you have things all over the place, right? In both jurisdictions, all kinds of things going on. And I don't think that it's right to say ROCOR adopted the Greek method. I think they tried to adopt, that's my understanding, and maybe I'm wrong. They've tried to follow the Kollyvades Fathers, the patristic Athenite stance. They tried to understand the need for krivia. They still left open economia. There's no, in the ROCOR practice dating from that decision, no one says the bishop doesn't have the power for economia. Of course he doesn't. There's still bishops in ROCOR who do receive by chrismation. But if they're following St. Nicodemus and the Holy Fathers, they're going to do it on the basis that is laid down with the criteria and the presuppositions. They're not going to do it when there's no immersion. That's just that. I know that doesn't sound right in certain academic circles, and we don't like that. It seems maybe simplistic or something. I don't know. But that's what the saints are saying, at least these saints. that we're talking about tonight. Now, another question. What about corrective baptism? Should they be allowed or prevented from happening? It's interesting you bring that up, because I discovered during my study of this text that St. Paisius and others were asking that very question to Dorotheos Voulismas. And he was saying, in the same spirit as, for instance, St. Firmilian, who says the exact same thing in the 3rd century, that yes, they should be baptized. If they were incorrectly, without basis, received, and it was essentially a bad use of economy, for lack of a better phrase. In other words, it was not blessed. It was not according to the patristic criteria. Then Voulismas says they should be baptized after the fact. And he explains that, yes, of course, the order of things is this, but in this case, it's justifiable, et cetera, et cetera. Maybe we'll present on that in a future podcast. Another question, Paisios, I might have already answered this. Is the question of exactitude and economia found in the ecumenical councils? Does that make it a dogmatic issue? If so, the question of exactitude in economia. Now, this question of economia goes back until very early. I said St. Basil. Right now, there's another name in the Roman Empire, and I'm trying to remember his name right now. He was a patron of Constantinople who writes about this, and I cannot remember it. Unfortunately, I don't have my library with me right now. So it's not disputed. Economia, no one disputes that there is economia. The only objection comes in the 20th century with its application to the reception of converts to the Orthodox Church. Economia and ecclesia as two ways to govern the church is universally accepted. Now, why they object in its application in this case? Well, that's a good question, and there's discussions of that among scholars like Florovsky, but it's not questioned in the Orthodox world of Saint Nikodemos and the Kollyvades Fathers. There's no question as to these are the interpretive keys. That's how the church works, whether it be reception of converts or whether it be a canon which calls for so many years of penance, the economia. We all know that. Nobody disputes that. So is it discussed in ecumenical councils like kate economia, kate ecclesia? I don't remember. I don't think so. I don't remember anything right now that comes to mind that they use that terminology in the canons. The canons generally are calling for a particular practice. Now, the canons could be expressing the economy of the church, like the canons on reception. It's clear, because in the same canon, they're saying these people like this and these people like that. So the idea that the canons are always the ecclesia is mistaken. I don't know where people get this idea, that they express the ecclesia. No, canons can also express the economia of the church. So this is what we're going to do in this case with these people, kate economia. So it's not a dogmatic issue per se, but it becomes it flows from dogma, and if it's distorted, it can represent a heretical idea of the church. In other words, you have to understand properly Christology, ecclesiology to understand, therefore, our pastoral practice. And so in that order, things are worked out. So they're inseparable, right? Economia, it flows from our life in the church, our experience of Christ, and our understanding of the body of Christ. And in that life and context and understanding, then it's applied and then it's understood. So when you see discussions or applications of economy which are inconsistent with that, it usually means you have another vision of the church. And so then it does touch on dogma, right? It does touch on dogma in those cases. But in and of itself, not necessarily a dogmatic issue. But again, this distinction, this needs to be really pointed out, because this whole discussion is in a theoretical basis when we talk about, is it dogmatic, is it non-dogmatic? Look, folks, dogma and ethos are inseparable. They're both expressions of our life. So you artificially separate them in your mind, but in reality, they're inseparable. They're the one and the same, right? You can't take my flesh and my spirit, you're going to kill me. You can't take away the dogma and the ethos, you're going to kill the church. They're inseparable. So in many ways, we have defined dogma way too narrowly today. Again, under the influence, I think of the West. I don't think that the Orthodox experience tells us to do that. There's the fathers on Athos are zealous about all the tradition, right? They're not going to say, oh, that's not a dogmatic issue. You can just throw that away. It doesn't happen. So this small tree T, big tree T distinction where people think, well, this is not, you can do whatever you want over here. That whole approach seems foreign to me when you're around people who are living immersed in the holy tradition. Like, the saints on Athos or the elders on Athos or the monastics and others that I've experienced, that's just not in their mindset. They don't make those kind of distinctions. Only academic theologians make these distinctions, right? In life, in the church, we don't make these sharp distinctions like, oh, is that a dogmatic issue? Oh, that's an ethical issue. But the ethos derives from the dogma. That's the whole point. In Orthodoxy, dogma is essentially the expression of the revelation of God, and it leads to life in Christ, and therefore the life in Christ, the ethos, is totally inseparable from the dogma, the teachings, and the understanding, which again is inseparable from the revelation and what God has given us. So these distinctions only go so far. Stavrula has a question. A priest that is subject to this erroneous reception, is his parish still worth attending? Well, I don't think we should ask it so abruptly, because obviously we've had this problem going on for 250 years, right? I mean, back in the time of St. Paisios, he was fighting it. I don't think we should walk away and say, because people don't understand or people don't get it or people aren't following the fathers, we should actually struggle to be, in some small way, help others to understand this. I mean, that's what I'm doing here tonight. That's why you're here. I think you're here because you want to hear what the saints have to say. And that's what I go to the contemporary authorities that I know, and I try to get the teaching to offer to you. So do the same. Don't walk away unless there is a heretical mindset, right? One thing to not understand. It's not one thing to not get it because you've never been exposed to it. It's one thing to be good-willed, but just ignorant. Another thing to have a heretical mindset where you're teaching and you're working from a heretical phronema outlook, and you're actually saying, for instance, in our day and age, oh, we're all the same. It's all essentially one church, but it's partial communion, or a new one that's going around, which is shocking to me from people who are very serious, and this has got to stop. If people don't realize this, I don't know what to say here. The idea that there is one church, Orthodox church, but there are heretical and heterodox groups that have the Eucharist, is a delusional heretical teaching. It is the epitome of ecumenism. And it is nothing, there's no way you can reconcile that with the teachings of the Holy Fathers. There's one church, one Christ, one Lord, one baptism, and that is in communion with one another. You cannot break and have heretical teachings and break off. And of course, with the Monophysites, you have a synodical condemnation, not once, not twice, but 4 times. I mean, if you want to go up to the Ninth Ecumenical Council, you've got it 6 times. So these ideas that float around today, they're not coming from the saints of the Orthodox Church, in my opinion, my experience. Maybe they think they are because they're reading different saints, church fathers, and then they're trusting their own interpretation of that, and then they get these crazy ideas. It's impossible to talk about one Christ, undivided, one church, undivided, and then talk about the Eucharist existing among those who are divided, manifestly divided from the Orthodox Church. Impossible. And it's just not the church is in the world. It's incarnational. The Lord is, the incarnation continues. It's in a particular time and place. It's the scandal of the particular, folks. You got to crucify your rational intellect and say, I can't figure it all out, but here it is, the manifestation of Christ in the world right now. And there's not multiple manifestations of Christ. It's only one. It's where the full 100% person of Christ is like the pleroma, right? The fullness of the faith is. And that doesn't mean like we count them up and all 100%. That means the person of Christ is there. And he can't be chopped up. We have a little bit of Christ over here, a little bit of Christ over there. That's not Christ anymore. That's an idea about Christ. That's teachings about Christ. You can have all kinds of different teachings about Christ, but there's only one place where you find the person of Christ incarnate, giving himself and given in every mystery. And when that is not in communion with another synaxis and the same teaching and the same grace and the same experience, then that other place is not the real thing. It's that simple. Can we receive the mysteries? Okay, question. John C. Okay, you're going back up to another question. I'm not really sure. Can we receive the mysteries from him if he's improperly received? I'm not sure what you're referring to above, though. I'm assuming you're talking about a priest who's not been properly received. But I don't see your question above. Oh, that's Stavrula's question. Okay, so you're John. I see. John is saying this is from Stavrula. So that is truly a difficult question to answer for sure. And we have difficult times today because of it. But we have to remember that the mysteries do not belong to a priest or a few people or even a congregation, but they belong to the church. In other words, they're expressions of Christ. He himself gives and is given, as we've said. And so if a priest is been deprived of a proper reception and has not been received as the Holy Fathers teach, well, this is a tragedy for that priest. But I can't see any reason to say that the mysteries which are given by Christ and the church and are based on the orthodoxy of the whole church are therefore negated or Christ walks away. But for the priest himself, I think there's problems. And it certainly does undermine the trust. And so there's a lot of terrible consequences from a departure from proper Orthodox ecclesiology and proper Orthodox reception of converts. But it's very problematic to go to either extreme here. You got to be very careful. You walk away from the church. You can end up walking away from the church if you're not careful, right? And say, well, this is, there's no church here anymore. I don't think that would not be healing. It would not be therapy. It would not be anything. And ultimately, it would be based on a erroneous idea that somehow the mystery is dependent. That's reminiscent of the Donatists, not exactly the same thing. But so I would not walk away from that parish, no. Although it is understandably very difficult, and I wish that wasn't the case, and I wish there was a correction of that. If chrismation by economy is supposed to confer the grace provided by baptism, why does a corrective baptism after that do according to tradition? Well, first of all, chrismation properly done by economy is not going to be done when there's no presupposition for that. That was the whole point we just went through for the last 2 hours. So a corrective baptism comes to correct an error, and that is the reception without the presuppositions. This is the teaching I'm presenting, right? Voulismas, St. Nikodemos, St. Paisius, and these others that they're embracing. They're saying there are presuppositions to economy. When you don't follow those presuppositions, you end up committing an error, which is not consistent with the teachings of the church and the grace of God and the will of God. Therefore, you have to correct that error. And that's when the presuppositions are not met and the criteria is not the proper criteria. So it wouldn't be what the example you cite is not one for corrective baptism. If somebody's truly chrismated by economy, it's a very good thing. It's salvation. And it does, of course, give them entry into the kingdom of God, into the church, into the mysteries. But that's when it's properly done and on the right basis. And you can't find that today with very, very few examples. Very exceptional. It's exceptional. They exist, but they're very exceptional. Like the vast majority of cases, unfortunately, today are just ignoring the presuppositions and in flagrant opposition to what the saints tonight I presented are teaching. And therefore, it creates tremendous upheaval for a lot of people. And they come to people like me, they find on the internet and they say, I wanted to be baptized. They would not baptize me. And I know that wasn't right. I didn't feel like it was right. Now, they can't explain all the theology and history and all that. but there's something in their conscience, they're bothering them. And many people say, no, just go back, you're fine, don't worry. On what basis are they saying that? You see, this is what bothers me. There's so little serious discussion going on about what the saints teach, what these saints teach. Yes, these, yes. You can tell me what St. Vincent of Lorraine said, but you know what? St. Vincent of Lorraine was never a major spokesman for orthodoxy on these topics. St. Nikodemos and the Kollyvades Fathers and the Rudder have been a pillar of orthodoxy, whether you like it or not, whether you agree it or not, whether you're in the Greek church or not. That's the reality. And so when you come and say innovators, you are throwing a bomb at the basis of the church's life for the last 200 years, which I can't but see as consistent with the bomb of ecumenism that has been thrown in the middle of the church. So it's very problematic, but just to answer your question again, corrective baptism corrects an error. The error is that they reject and ignore the presuppositions and the criteria for the proper application of economy. So therefore, in the case that chrismation is done by economy truly and it's beneficial, there's no need for corrective baptism. And unfortunately, again, those cases are very, very rare today. Hopefully, that basic truth and point has been driven home, and you can take that away and understand that. It's an interpretive. If you have that in your mind, you can interpret a lot of what's going on in the church today in regard to this issue. Is the practice of the half chrismation something ever done during the Kollyvades time, or indeed ever? What does that mean, half chrismation? In the OCA today, Roman Catholics will be chrismated only on the forehead. No, that's I don't know what that is. I've heard about that, but when I went to Mount Athos, the fathers there said that's not chrismation as we've done it and understood it, and that's not how it's practiced in the Greek Orthodox Church, the ecumenical patriarchate. So I don't know why they do that and where they got that from. It would be interesting to see. Is that some kind of innovation, or is there some kind of basis for that? I don't know. Don't know about that. So we're at 2 hours and 41 minutes. We always end up going way late on these things. This is an extensive podcast, but we're gonna wrap it up with two more questions for everybody, and then we're gonna wrap it up. All right. So here we go with a question from Nathan Bedna over at Crowdcast. How are we to apply the canons with great discernment and with wisdom? Question. Everything about this Canon 46 regarding baptism seems like we can apply exactly as stated. However, I happened to read the Apostolic Canon 61 from the Rudder today, and it says, if one had sexual relations before marriage or committed adultery, he cannot be a priest or reader or even a janitor in the church. This touches on the sanctity of the person. We apply those differently from the more theological canons. That's a very interesting question, very difficult question. You always ask difficult questions over in Crowdcast. You don't give the man any breathing room. Nathan goes on, if I even read another canon that said a layman can't enter the altar, and I hope God forgive us for allowing the Lowell's workers to do floor work in the altar. Chrysostom answers, I'm guessing if Canon 61 was applied to the letter, there wouldn't be any clergy, unfortunately, especially. Okay, so this is a very interesting topic, which I'm not going to be able to answer fully tonight because it's really not the topic for tonight. But there's no question about it that there is economia in the church, and the application of canons is not done either theoretically, either from a distance, and either from a layman. It's given to the apostles, to the successors of the apostles, to those who've been blessed by the apostles to guide the people of God, in other words, the clergy. And that has to be done with great discernment and with great fear of God. And that applies across the board. What cannot happen in the application of the canons is ignoring the criteria and presuppositions laid down by the Holy Fathers for a proper and orthodox application of the canons. Does that make sense? It's not just, oh, I'm a priest, I got the power. It's not enough. Oh, I'm a bishop, I can do whatever I like. This is the subjectivity that Dorotheos Voulismas was saying is a major temptation for the church, and we've got to be careful. And I totally agree with him. I think this is what's happened in our day. We've come to an absurd level of this. The bishop said, therefore, that's not necessarily the case. What did he say? On what basis did he say it? Or the priest, or whoever it is. We in Orthodoxy, we're not authoritarians. We don't agree with authoritarianism. We're not papists, and we're not Protestants either. So we can do whatever we want. It's the middle road. It's the royal path. Neither extreme, folks. The royal path. So coming to this particular topic, is there room for economia for those who've had after baptism? Okay, so that you didn't mention that, but the canons are clear. Before one is baptized, if someone falls into sexual sins, baptism washes all of it away, and he can be, according to the canons, a priest. If someone's been baptized and they fall into sexual sins, the canons are pretty explicit that if those when I say sexual sins, I mean sexual intercourse outside of marriage. The canons put the border right there and say this is no longer permissible. And the saints interpret that, like contemporary saints like Saint Philodeus. I call him saint. He's not been glorified officially, but he's a saint. Philodeus Voulismas says you can be a saint, for instance, but you can't be a priest. Has there been economia by certain local churches? Absolutely. Today in the 21st century, bishops and even whole synods, I'm not going to name names, have decided to economize on this canon. Is there room for economy? I don't know. Saints don't seem to agree that I've read, but I'm not a bishop. It's not my role to say there's no room for economy. Is it overturning the whole spirit of the canon? I don't know. It's hard. It's very hard. I know, for instance, I knew a bishop very well in Greece who, for a number of years as a bishop, he resisted doing this, and he told me so. I said, "I'm not." He says, "I'm not going to ordain those who've fallen into sexual intercourse." And he did, and he waited, and he waited, and he waited to find eligible priests, and then he gave in. He caved. He was a very pious man. He proposed, fortunately, 2 years ago. So I know other bishops. I know particularly Anthony, holy bishop, saint. He was the bishop of Siatista in northern Greece. I had the blessing to meet him, to be at his funeral. Saint. He was a saint. He actually, I think he ordained a lot of Elder Ephraim's monks, Amanathos at Philotheo. He was close to Elder Ephraim. I'm pretty sure he never gave it on this. He never caved on this. So I don't know what to say. It's a bishop's decision. It's very difficult. But I would say something else to you. If you're interested in becoming a priest and you've had this problem, let's put that aside for a minute. If you're thinking about becoming a priest today, let me just tell you something. In my opinion, it's my opinion. Do not become a priest unless you're ready to be persecuted, unless you're ready to be suspended for faithfulness to the Holy Tradition, because it's not unlikely that if you're doing things right today, you will be persecuted. So I do not, people come to me all the time, should I go to the priesthood, go to the seminary? I would say to all of them, maybe. Are you ready to be crucified? Are you ready to be exiled? I don't know. Are you ready to be suspended? Because during COVIDism, that's what you were faced with for a lot of priests. Right? We need good priests today. God help us in the days ahead. We need good priests. But don't go in with any kind of delusions that it's going to be easy. It's going to be a total crucifixion. So if you are spiritually struggling and you don't know, you don't have a strong and clear spiritual father who's guiding you clearly and preparing you for the priesthood, go slow. Go slow. Don't run. On this side, on the layman side of the priesthood, and especially young men, it's exciting. I want to be a priest. I want to be a priest, right? Once you get over on the other side and you start to assume the responsibilities and you see the temptations and you see the traps, you'll think differently. You'll say, okay, now this is going to be my salvation right here. I mean, St. John didn't say it exactly like this. It's a little bit misquote, but the meaning is there. Right? The meaning is there. And he said, the path to hell is clothed is paved with essentially the miters or the kalimafkas, whatever you want to say, of priests and bishops. Why? Because when you know and you don't do, then what kind of servant are you, right? So God help us in these latter days to really discern our role and our place in the church. If we're called and we've got a blessing, prepare yourself appropriately and don't run for any kind of authority. God help those people who have run to put on the mitre. God help them. If they have not understood that it means crucifixion, God help them. Nathan has another question, quick, and then we're out. We'll pick it up on Thursday, 6 p.m. question and answer session for this course and other questions. Join us if you're not already following and you want to have your questions answered. I hope you'll join us. Did St. Nicodemus say that the presuppositions of Economia was fruitless and of lesser worth and not worthy of consideration? No, it's not what he said. He said he's not going to argue with Voulismas over the criteria of how and when the church did economy, in particular with regard to the ordinations of, for instance, the iconoclasts who had not yet been condemned. He said, look, St. Nicodemus, you're saying the same thing, but you're not going further enough to explain the why and the how. And in this case, for instance, the Seventh Ecumenical Council received those priests without ordination because they were never condemned in council. And therefore, that's a totally different context than other examples in church history when they were. And they were received by ordination, they were baptized and ordained, etc. The Paulinians, for instance, in the First Ecumenical Council, were ordered to be baptized. So he's not saying, but he's saying, I'm not going to, he doesn't want to argue with him. Like he's saying, I'm going to humble myself. Whatever you say, this is the monastic in him. This is the humble man. He says, let it be blessed. I'm going to defer to you. You're the great teacher and preacher of the faith. I'm just a lowly monk. Okay. Don't misinterpret St. Nicodemus as being either pietistic or indifferent, or therefore interpreting Voulismas as some kind of tyrant. All of those are misunderstandings of St. Nicodemus. I understood Voulismas was saying this is important. St. Nicodemus was saying that in the letter they didn't think that was worth debating, but maybe I misunderstand. Okay, hopefully, Nathan, right? Let me know. Give me a shout out. You understood what I just said. The proper context. That's how I think his blessed Father, that's the monastic in him saying, let it be blessed. I don't want to argue. I think you're right. Basically, I think as hard to interpret it. I think that's fine. I'm okay with that. I'm not going to go with it. It's not me. I don't really understand the way, but that's fine. He didn't see this as unimportant, as worthless, but he didn't say I'm going to argue over it either. So I don't know if that makes any sense. And it's very common in the monastic life, and it's proper to say, I'm going to defer to you. Let it be blessed. I'm humble. And that's how I interpret what St. Nicodemus is saying. People can debate me and say, no, I think that's wrong, but it's fine. All right. So we're going to check out. This has been good. Chrysostomos. Okay, one more question. Chrysostomos looked like he has an interesting question here. I read in the slides that if the immersion was not the apostolic form, it's automatic reason to not grant economia. That's proper. Yes, that's what he's talking about. He's saying it's got it. That's a presupposition for economia. We're talking about the heterodox, though, right? Outside the church. 99% of heterodox baptisms are not in the apostolic form. That's true. I've just said that as well repeatedly. How do the ecumenists justify this economia even when the form is wrong? Well, they reject the saints. They reject the saints. This is what we've been talking about tonight. Why is Professor Yangou, who knows these texts better than any of us, not walking away clearly saying there's no room for economia among the papists? That's the great question. This is a very learned man. I've met him. I've talked to him. He knows what he's reading. He understands. He's not saying everything all the time, which is a little unsettling to me. I don't think he's being totally transparent on what St. Nicodemus teaches personally, but I'm looking forward to reading his book. I have an open mind, but I don't know what else to tell you. They just ignore the saints. I mean, can you walk away after seeing everything that we presented and our lecture last year on the Kollyvades Fathers? Can you walk away saying, yeah, it doesn't really matter if they're immersed or not? Well, you can only say that if you don't really care what St. Nicodemus taught or St. Paisios taught or St. Athanasius taught. Or you're going to start and say, well, I like what the other saints teach. I'll go get that. The question is, are what saints so-and-so in the 14th century in France or 7th century in Syria, are they speaking in the same way and with the same weight as Basil the Great or, somebody like St. Nicodemus or others who actually at length dealt with and taught and their teachings have been embraced by the church? Can we compare that? Is that the same weight? I don't think so. And we're not going to, in the Orthodox Church, we have not been heavily influenced by certain Western church fathers in the formation of our pastoral practice. And therefore, and in the West, we have examples of an ecclesiology which is tweaked. Augustine's approach is tweaked. It's not the same approach that we see in St. Basil or St. Maximus the Confessor, for instance, in terms of what's going on outside the church, what's going on inside the church, where are the borders of the grace of God in terms of purification, illumination, deification. These are different approaches. And Augustine was never informative or formative for the Orthodox Church in council, in the ecumenical councils. He just wasn't. Sorry, you guys love Augustine. I get that. He was not formative for the ecumenical councils, for the teachings of the saints for the last 2,000 years in the Orthodox Church. So if you want to get, what is the Orthodox phronima? What's the mindset? You're not going to run to Augustine. You can go get all kinds of things from Augustine. It's wonderful. He's a blessed Saint Augustine. I don't deny that he's been glorified by the church, but is it the same weight and same impact? In the West, it was the voice of the West, but not in the Orthodox Church, not in the councils of the church, not in the great fathers of the East. He wasn't. So stop trying to put him above or at the same weight, right? This is what's going on with a lot of converts. They're coming from the papal Protestants, they're coming from the Calvinists, and they just love Augustine. They want everything in that context. They want to look through the Orthodox Church in that context. It's just the opposite. Put him aside and pick him up after 10 years. Put him aside. You're going to say, well, he's a saint in the church. Put him aside and pick him up after 10 years. You've been immersed in Augustine. You've eaten and drank Augustine for 20 years, whatever. Put him aside and run to the saints which have formed the consciousness of the church on these key ecclesiological and pastoral questions. It's not Augustinian in large measure. I know you don't like it, but that's the reality. Been good. God bless you. God bless you. God keep you. Forgive me in my great enthusiasm for the course tonight. I didn't begin with the customary troparion and the customary prayer, but it is a podcast, which of course podcasts, we don't do that. So I'm a little conflicted. Next time we come around, we'll make it work. So we're going to end, as we always do with our podcast, with our exit chanting from Mount Athos, from Vatopedi Monastery. And we look forward to seeing you this Thursday on Patreon. And we look forward to seeing you next Tuesday for the third lesson of our series on the Book of Revelation. Third lesson. See you next Tuesday for that, right here on all these channels, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and Crowdcast this Thursday for our patrons. God bless you all. Be good. Struggle hard. Repent harder. And we'll see you soon. Patros, nie, bez hartum do krono, ex tu